markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change on the S&P right now. Down 2 points to 54.58, down less than 0.1%. The Dow also little change now, struggling for direction, but down 7 points. We have got the NASDAQ Composite Index holding on to a 46-point gain right now, up by about 0.3%. U.S. bond market got hit as traders weigh the potential economic implications of the November presidential election. 10-year, 4.47%. The 2-year, 4.77%. Gold up 0.1%, $23.28 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.3%, $82.61 a barrel. Chewy shares lower after an initial surge after Keith Gill, also known as Roaring Kitty, disclosed a 6.6% passive stake in the online pet food and product retailer. Shares of Chewy right now, they are trading lower by 5.2%. Among other meme stocks, GameStop now down by 8.8%. Recapping, S&P down 5, down 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thanks so much, Charlie Pellet, Alex Steele, alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and finance and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. And there may be a storm brewing in D.C. There is definitely a storm brewing in the Caribbean. Apparently, there's a record-breaking Hurricane Beryl that is intensifying as it churns through the Caribbean south of Grenada. It has regained Category 4 strength after briefly weakening. We're talking top winds of 130 miles per hour. Well, Matthew Palazzoa is a senior analyst in P&C Insurance over at Bloomberg Intelligence, and he joins us now. Now, Matthew, I know you look at the stuff through the lens of insurers, but can you just give us some perspective of how you're looking at this storm?
Yeah, so for perspective, as you had said, the earliest Category 4 in the Atlantic since 2005. 2005 was one of the worst hurricane seasons on record.
Was that Katrina?
Katrina was one of those storms in that year. So right now it's early. We're looking at it. It seems to be. I always look at it, is it going to impact the United States, right? The islands obviously matter, but generally for global insured losses, something on Florida or, in Texas, Louisiana, those are the kind of big money loss events. What it looks like is going to happen here is it will probably hit the Yucatan Peninsula. It will probably cross a lot of the islands in the Caribbean south of the Greater Antilles. But so we're looking at that, and we're looking at past events in Mexico. In 2005, there was also Wilma hit Mexico and caused almost $8 billion in economic losses. The insured were a lot less. I do think Bertle's going to slow down, though, so it probably wouldn't be that bad.
What's it tell you, or what is it the insurance company's telling you about kind of how they view hurricanes, other extreme events thing? It's always in the news here, extreme heat, extreme storms, extreme. What do the insurance companies say? Because they're the ones that actually have money at stake here.
Skin in the game on it.
Skin in the game.
So what they will say is climate change is having an impact. You wouldn't directly blame all these things on climate change. It's very hard to exactly say. One of the good things about the global industry, though, is that it reprices on an annual basis, right? Generally, all these policies are written every year. So they can reprice things as they go along. They could leave regions as they go along. You are hearing these record-breaking things. Even last year, which turned out to be a mild hurricane season, there was a bunch of activity earlier in the season.
So based on that, what the areas in the U.S., for example, that are exposed to these kind of intense changing storms, are insurers still insuring houses there? Like, are they still doing the job, or has all the stuff changed? That was a really intelligent question. Are they doing the stuff, or has the stuff changed?
Some stuff has changed, some stuff hasn't.
There we go.
The insurers are leaving certain areas, mostly California, honestly. The Florida market.
Interesting. Is that wildfires? Because
yes, wildfires, and the regulation is tough in some of these states too. So what you saw in Florida was a litigious environment that was driving up a lot of costs, and insurers and reinsurers pulled out of there. The state has done a lot of things to address that. So you see insurance companies actually tending to start to go back.
Didn't Warren Buffett go back?
So Buffett, Berkshire's reinsurance unit had a
Right.
big bet on Florida last year. We don't actually know. They disclosed it at the annual meeting last year. They didn't talk about it this year necessarily. So we don't exactly know if they're there. I would suspect they probably are, but I can't confirm.
Okay. So, but if I want to go out and buy a condo down in Florida on the coast, can I get that insured?
You can. What is happening, you probably won't get
I'm
it
not
insured.
doing it, by the way,
In case you're wondering. You can. It will probably be through a Florida company, like a smaller insurance company. You're probably not going to get, you might get an Allstate, I don't know. But you're not going to get one of these probably national name brands. You'll probably get a smaller company. You're definitely going to pay a high price. You may even get it through the state fund. So Alex, to your other question before, one of the things that is happening is that there's an insurer of last resort in a lot of these states. So it's essentially the state insurance company. It's not. It's an insurance company, so it's not like just backed by taxpayer money. It's supposed to be self-sufficient, but it can always rely on the state. So a lot of people will end up getting insured through those mechanisms.
What about reinsurance?
So the reinsurance market really, I think, is returning to Florida. So these things that were hurting it, it's kind of a wait and see. The prices went up a lot, especially for catastrophe-prone regions, stuff like Florida. So it became, to Paul's point earlier, it became attractive to some companies like Berkshire Hathaway to get back into these markets.
How are these property and casualty stocks trading? Are they trading on the fundamentals of each company? Or are they trading on, or do they typically trade on interest rates? How do they trade?
So the P&C companies trade less on interest rates than life insurance companies. The life insurance companies are way more levered, assets to equity. They have bigger portfolios. These names, they'll tend to move on the pricing in the cycle, sometimes the weather. Interest rates will help. They're kind of in line with the market this year. Some have done better, so the auto insurance companies are doing a little bit better. We probably talked about that in the past, but they were having huge increase in loss costs, so cars were more expensive to fix, and that is kind of abating a bit, so those names have done better.
What about rates? So Fed cuts, interest rates, how does that affect the insurance market? And does it matter as much, considering that some of these places are going to get hit no matter what because of all the changing weather?
So it won't matter on the underwriting side much. Potentially it could, in that interest rates they help investment income, which could subsidize underwriting. But realistically, lower interest rates will hurt investment income. Depending on how low they go, maybe not dramatically. It probably does not change underwriting decisions, though. But net, lower rates are a bad thing for these companies.
All right, if I'm buying property and casualty insurance stocks, what kind of dividend yields am I getting on these things?
They're not dramatically high. I mean, they're probably less than what you'd get on the S&P. I mean, it's 2 or 3%.
Yep.
I don't think they love to be locked into returning capital, so they'll favor share repurchase instead.
And are they doing that?
Yeah, I mean, they're buying back shares. They'll tend to pause during hurricane season. This is by some estimates, quote, the hurricane season from hell coming up.
Oh, great.
That was a headline. I don't know if it was clickbait or not, but it was a headline. So you may see the second, third quarter repurchase slow down, but that's usually the main mechanism.
What about consolidation in this industry? You mentioned some smaller players, say in Florida. What does that wind up looking like?
I don't think you're going to see big consolidation in the industry. So there's a completely separate issue with liability loss reserves, where they write these policies, and then many years later they may have claims on them, and that is starting to rear its head in terms of we didn't get maybe great pricing years ago. So I think it's going to be a headwind to large consolidation. You may see it on the smaller side, companies that I don't necessarily even cover, like those maybe smaller Florida names might get scooped up. There are companies that are starting up and taking policies out of the state fund, which is not necessarily consolidation, but it's kind of helping, and that's a business. But when they get whacked by a hurricane, we'll see how those companies do.
What's the best idea in insurance these days? What do people want to talk about the most?
I mean, the reinsurance story seems to have played out a little bit. The reserves are an issue. Climate change is an issue. Cyber insurance is a kind of big issue. You've seen this now with the auto dealers, right? Some estimates say it could be the biggest line of insurance eventually. What the insurance companies have done historically is kept limits very low on this. So even in a big event, they're only paying out a small amount. But some will say it's actually an uninsurable risk, that it's completely correlated. So they want to stay away from things that could affect a huge group, like a flood that could flood a state or something like that. This is something that could shut down, swaths of the country, so they want to stay away from it.
Well, we appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
good stuff.
Matthew Palazoa of Bloomberg Intelligence. He covers everything insurance and reinsurance, and then by de facto, you're like a storm analyst and does the weather for us as well. So we do appreciate that. But that's kind of scary, right? Like already a Category 4 storm,
Yep.
and it's
This
only,
early.
what is it,
I was
beginning of
looking
July?
at the map.
Yeah.
Matt's got a great the map from the one of those
Ooh.
mapping people that go out there and it's cutting right across the Caribbean, right across the ocean, hitting the Mexican peninsula. So that could be harsh for our good friends in like Cancun, things like that.
Yikes. Yeah,
Yep.
it doesn't look very good there. Okay, just taking a check in here on the markets. You're looking at equities relatively soft on the day. Flat, S&P and the Dow Jones, and the NASDAQ, you're up by about 0.3%. Volume a little bit mixed. Obviously, the bar market continuing to sell off. The weaker manufacturing ISM data, and just honestly, a lot of uncertainties over politics. How do you even price that in? And which markets do you wind up pricing that into as the Supreme Court? It says that President Trump does have partial immunity related to some cases. So we want to keep you up to date on everything that's happening in business and economics, but also world and national news. There was a French primary thing yesterday. That was a big deal. Michael Barr is joining us for world and national news. Michael.
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, and Charlie. And let's get more now into the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results, all but ensuring that a trial won't happen before the November election. The justices, voting 6-3 along ideological lines, said a federal appeals court was too categorical in rejecting Trump's immunity arguments, ruling for the first time that former presidents are shielded from prosecution for some official acts taken while in office. The majority ordered the lower courts to revisit the case to decide the extent of the allegations that are off limits to prosecution. Law professor Harold Krent of the Chicago Kent College of Law.
The drone strikes, the president would be absolutely immune both criminally and civilly for those, as long as they're within the outer ambit of his official functions. But again, there's going to be hard line drawing cases to make about what constitutes an official act of the presidency and what is a sort of private or unofficial act. And that's what Judge Shushkin will have to face now in the coming weeks.
That is law professor Harold Krent at Chicago Kent College of Law. In a post, former President Trump called the ruling a big win for our Constitution. Hurricane Beryl is closing in on the southeastern Caribbean, and government officials are pleading with people, please take shelter. Hurricane warnings are in effect for Barbados, St. Lucia, and other islands. It is the earliest Category 4 hurricane on record, with winds of at least 130 miles per hour. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change on the S&P 500 index right now, down by 1 point. We have got the Dow swinging between gains and losses, up 34 right now, up by about 0.1%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index higher by 47, up by 0.3%. 10-year yield 4.47%, the 2-year 4.77%. Gold, $23.26 right now, down by $1, little change. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.6%, $82.85 right now for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. The outlook for American factories took a turn for the worse based on one closely watched report. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The ISM Factory Index signaled contraction for the third month in a row in June, reflecting a slowdown in production and hiring, though orders perked up. A measure of inflation also declined. Recent manufacturing reports have sent mixed signals, with government data showing factory orders for business equipment dropping in May. In another economic report issued Monday, the Commerce Department said construction spending dropped in May, the first decline since late 2022. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And speaking of manufacturing, Boeing is buying back Spirit AeroSystems Holdings for $37.25 a share in an all-stock deal that values the supplier at $4.7 billion. Boeing up 2.4%, Spirit AeroSystems up by 3.3%. Recapping, S&P just turning higher again, little changed, up by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pello, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in Midtown Manhattan. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. Boy, a busy 24 hours for Boeing. The U.S. Justice Department plans to charge Boeing with criminal fraud after finding the company violated a 2021 deferred prosecution agreement tied to 2 previous fatal crashes. And Bloomberg News was reporting that late yesterday. And then just hours later, Boeing announced a plan to buy back Spirit AeroSystems. As Charlie was just reporting, a supplier that it had spun off 2 decades ago. They're going to pay $4.7 billion in a bid to improve manufacturing. Stock today up about 2.5%, but down about 28% year to date. So let's get the latest on what's happening at Boeing. Very busy over there. With George Ferguson. He covers the airlines. He covers the aerospace companies for Bloomberg Intelligence. George, how do you put into context what's happened to Boeing over these last several years? Where does the company go from here?
So I guess the way I put it in context would be a lot of air outsourcing at Boeing, including Spirit AeroSystem a couple of decades ago. 787 was one of these watershed events where they were trying to outsource large portions of the manufacture and even engineering is probably the better term than design, engineering on that airplane. And now I think, the company in the midst of pulling some of that supplier base back in so they can control quality and improve production output. So I think that's where they are. And the weekend's events are, I think, all, steps on the path to improving production, eliminating distractions, improving quality. There's more to come.
Mm-hmm.
More to do, and they need a strong recovery in the second half. They can't burn cash like they've been burning, but that's what I would say. Kind of where we are right now is we're in the process of cleaning that whole outsourcing mess up.
So as it relates to the fraud charges, etc., do they have to pay a boatload of money to people on this, or can they spend a boatload of money instead on making sure that their programs are good and their quality control is good?
So I'm going to first, caveat this whole thing with I'm not an attorney, so that we're in some realms there that I don't totally understand. But I believe it's something for $500 million worth of fines they'd have to pay if they agree to the current Justice Department proposal, and they'd have to bring in an outside, sort of quality manager, overseer. I think that they have some rights to sort of negotiate over who that would be. So to me, that doesn't sound like an extremely onerous provisions. I think it's something that, again, they got to get out of their way to start to build more aircraft and focus on improving their processes, their production processes. So to me, it doesn't sound bad. I don't know what the other sort of legal ramifications are here on that.
How many planes are they building per month now, George, and where do they need to get to?
So I don't know that we know, right? It looks like the second quarter is going to have less deliveries than the first quarter. We still have to see what the June deliveries were, but through May, they were on a lower trajectory than they were in 1Q. I suspect, again, things like managing quality down at Spirit are slowing things down. The negotiations with Spirit have been slowing things down. The discussion with the FAA about the way forward and the processes to make sure the quality is higher has been slowing things down. And we don't know how many of whatever they delivered in 2Q was delivered out of the inventory that they already built, right? They want to get rid of that inventory, which is, I think really onerous on efficiency because they need folks to maintain airplanes that are already built and sitting in the desert. But so either way, we kind of think 2Q is going to be below 1Q, a rough quarter, probably a $4 billion plus cash use after any sort of maintenance capex. So I think the full story here really is 3Q and 4Q this year. They just can't keep burning $4 billion of cash per quarter. And so again, I think you see the fury of activity as we enter the beginning of summer at Boeing, and I think it's all about tidying up these issues they need to tidy so they can get at building and delivering a lot more airplanes in the second half and lowering cash burn significantly.
Just going to the Spirit thing for a moment. So Airbus is going to be taking over parts of Spirit that make components for its own aircraft. How does that work? Does that make it like a separate company within Airbus, or is it totally going to be absorbed by Airbus? What does that look like?
So, I mean, the press release I saw today made me believe that it's going to be fully taken out of Spirit Aerosystems, at least large portions of it, and pulled into Airbus. I thought much more interesting too in that whole disclosure was Airbus is getting paid, like I think it was $559 million, something just over $500 million to take those businesses, to take the businesses and take the assets. So we knew that was a drag on Spirit, and it seems like maybe a pretty significant drag. Again, I think something that really helps potentially improve Boeing quality and throughput is a management team not focused on trying to economize, especially on a big loss-making contracts like the Airbus contracts.
Hey, George, if Boeing doesn't have enough balls in the air, they also now need to find a new CEO because Chief Executive Officer David Calhoun, he said he's going to step down by year end at the latest. Who's going to take this job?
Oh, that's George's favorite question.
This is a hard job to take, and they would love to have someone in place, I think, to manage these problems and the upcoming ones. I don't know. There's a lot of speculation in the marketplace. I'd be throwing darts at a dartboard. I just know it needs to be a good manufacturing person. Someone focused on manufacturing shop floor kind of quality. I will tell you, we're going to step from these two problems they're going to go on to simmer, right? Spirit doesn't get purchased until sometime next year. There's a lot of details to get worked out between now and then. DOJ's, they may agree. They're trying to negotiate with them. They could decide not to agree and end up in a lawsuit. And I'll tell you that as we get into September, one of Boeing's most important unions will come to the table. That's when their contract expires. And so so the hits just keep on coming here, I think. And that will be another very interesting challenge because I think those workers probably get some very nice increases. If you get into a strike, that second half recovery at Boeing is really, put into question because you can't make airplanes with your most important union striking. And again, they're going to want some good pay raises.
All right, George, good stuff. Boy, it's like a full-time job just figuring out what's going on with Boeing. But boy, it's one of those companies you feel like too big to fail in so many different ways.
Totally.
But they really turn things is around. George Ferguson covers all things airlines, aerospace for Bloomberg Intelligence. Looking at the markets here, very little movement there at the index level. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got Chewy shares down now by 5.9%. Chewy is slumping after Keith Gill disclosed a 6.6% passive stake in the online pet food and product retailer. Gill, who operates under the moniker of Roaring Kitty, shot to fame in 2021 as he rallied retail traders around the video game store GameStop. GameStop shares today, they are lower by 5.4%. Chewy again after an initial bounce higher, down by 6%. Tesla is expected to report a second straight quarter of declining electric vehicle deliveries. When it reports those numbers tomorrow, it would be the second time that has happened since Tesla phased out the Roadster more than a decade ago. But as Bloomberg Global Autos editor Craig Trudell reports, CEO Elon Musk is hoping investors will look past recent setbacks.
In spite of that trend, you're seeing, sort of more emphasis, more focus on that, August 8th, date. The idea that Musk is going to sort of pull a rabbit out of a hat and unveil a robo-taxi, which, I think there's, of course, reason to be, bullish on the business plan there, the prospects for that business, but actually executing it has been another matter for every company that's tried to bring one of those to market.
Bloomberg's Craig Trudell. Tesla shares, they're up now by 6%. Sales data compiled by Bloomberg showed Chinese EV maker BYD sold a record number of electric and hybrid cars in the second quarter as price cuts and new technology stoked consumers into purchases. Again, among U.S. EV makers, Tesla shares up by 6%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the up-to-date news in business, finance, and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you updated on all the world and national news that you need to know. And for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, Charlie, and a lot to talk about. Donald Trump asked the U.S. Supreme Court to rule that any action he took as president was immune from prosecution after he left office. The Supreme Court, by 6-3, said only some actions fill the bill. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman reports from Washington.
Trump lawyer John Sauer, when the case was argued, said that without such immunity,
every current president will face de facto blackmail and extortion by his political rivals while he is still in office.
Justice Sonia Sotomayor asked Sauer,
the president assisting in creating a fraudulent slate of electoral candidates. That would be within his right to do?
Absolutely, Your Honor. The word fraudulent, I dispute that characterization.
Sauer conceded that an ex-president could be prosecuted for personal misdeeds, so a lower court should sort out which were official acts. That's what the Supreme Court determined and sent the case back to lower courts. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
The former president says that this is a big win for our Constitution and democracy. Hurricane Beryl is pounding the southeast Caribbean as a powerful Cat 4 storm after becoming the earliest storm that strengthened to form in the Atlantic, fueled by record warm waters. Beryl made landfall on one of the islands of Grenada. French voters face a decisive vote on July 7th in the runoff of snap parliamentary elections. In round one, Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally won a smaller margin of victory than some polls indicated. For round two, the left-wing and centrist parties are weighing whether to pull candidates to keep the far-right out of power. Cases of COVID-19 are on the rise across the U.S. as a new variant spreads. Dr. William Schaffner with the Vanderbilt Medical Center, Nashville, says these new COVID variants are grandchildren of Omicron, the most common variant, and are very, very contagious.
Virtually all of us have had some experience with COVID in the past, whether through infection or vaccination or both. So what we call our population immunity is much better, so there are fewer severe diseases.
Dr. William Schaffner. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, and Charlie.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. So here is a fun one that just really caught my eye. So apparently, guys, Inca Investments, which is the investment arm of the largest IKEA retailer, is apparently taking a stake in a new tower going up Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. That's going to be about Fifth Avenue and right in the Diamond District, in the early 40s, like 48th, 49th Street, that kind of area. It's going to be 80,000 square feet. And it's going to be things like an IKEA customer meeting point. I have no idea what that is.
Is that it? Do we have an IKEA store in New York?
Well, we have one in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, yeah. That's where all couples go to break up before they move in together. Yeah. Have you ever had that? That, like, if you ever gone to as a couple, you will come out in a fight and mad at each other, and that's like a huge thing to do to overcome the IKEA shopping experience. And then there's like an IKEA store right around here, actually, on 3rd Avenue. But a store is like it's like you buy pillows or like maybe, you know,
buying the big
throw
furniture.
or, not that at all.
Okay, so is that coming, though? Or are we going to get a big IKEA
Well, that's
store?
what I can't tell. It's a customer meeting point, but no one seems to know what that actually entails. One option being considered is a traditional store where customers could buy and carry out products.
See, I think they should do that.
That's something, isn't it?
Moving around apartments every couple of years, got to buy furniture, lug the old stuff. So I don't know.
I can't tell if this is like a good thing for Fifth Avenue or like not a good thing for Fifth Avenue.
Fifth Avenue and that 47, 48?
47.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I think any commercial tenant coming in to some of these buildings is a good thing, because we still have empty space all around our office.
Fair enough. That's what we really need on Fifth Avenue, is a bunch of people with huge IKEA bags walking around. Anyway, that wraps it up for me and Paul. It has been quite a day. A Balance of Power with Joe Matthew is up next. Supreme Court ruling front and center. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Donald Trump's January 6th trial will wait. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the Supreme Court rules on presidential immunity without really ruling, kicking it back down to a lower court and putting Jack Smith's trial on indefinite delay. We're going to get the latest from Bloomberg legal reporter Eric Larson coming up with insights from constitutional law attorney Robert McWhirter, a conversation you will not want to miss. And we'll explore the political side of this story as the Biden campaign, all the while, tries to recover from last Thursday's debate. Bloomberg politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis is with us, along with Democratic strategist Brad Howard of the Corcoran Street Group. We start, as always, on Wall Street. Let's do that right now. A check on the markets live from New York. Here's Charlie Pellett.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Good day from New York. Indeed, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing right now. Green on the screen, but not a whole lot. Little change, truth be told, right now on the S&P, up 3 points. That is a gain of just about 1/10%. We got the Dow up 30, higher by about 1/10%, and NASDAQ up 78, gain there of 0.4%. Treasuries are being hit as traders weigh U.S. election risks. 10-year, 4.47%, with the 2-year right now, 4.77%. Spot gold, little changed, up $1.50 the ounce to $23.28, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.7%, $82.96 a barrel. After last week's presidential debate, Wall Street is reassessing the outlook for the November election and implications for investors. Cameron Dawson is Chief Investment Officer at New Edge Wealth.
Based on Thursday night, does that raise the odds of a Republican sweep where you could see more sweeping policies? You could see the full extent of the effort of policies actually be enacted. And I think that would be the risk for the market, is that you do get this inflation, you do get higher deficit spending, and to point out the tax cuts that you would potentially get going into a second round of a Trump presidency are not nearly as big as what we got in 2017.
Cameron Dawson of New Edge Wealth. Boeing makes it official. It is buying back Spirit AeroSystems Holdings for $37.25 a share in an all-stock deal that values the supplier at $4.7 billion. Boeing up on that news, up 3.1%. Spirit AeroSystems up 3.6%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, little change on the S&P 500 index. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellett, thank you. Welcome to Monday, the Monday edition of Balance of Power, live from Washington on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I am Joe Matthew, and if anyone asks, from here on out, I am acting in my official duties as a Bloomberg employee and as host of this program. We're invoking broadcast immunity today as we turn to Trump versus the United States. Everybody got up early today in Washington, at least those of us who are left. Pretty quiet in town. Senate gone, the House is out. President making his way back from Camp David. No traffic. But everyone dialed in on the Supreme Court, which ruled Donald Trump has, in fact, some immunity from criminal charges for his efforts to reverse the 2020 election results. 6-3 ideological lines, not a shock, but also not simple. They're basically kicking this back down to the appeals court to determine what counts as an official duty, an official action, versus a private one when it comes to, in this case, Donald Trump or any president moving forward here. We're going to get into the contours of this ruling, a ruling for the ages, we were told back in April by the Chief Justice. But in fact, the court once again didn't really rule. They just kicked it back down, in this case, to the appeals court. And Jack Smith is left holding the bag in what looks like a January 6th trial that simply cannot begin before the election. Let's get into it. On this day that Donald Trump calls it a big win for our Constitution and democracy, proud to be an American, he writes in all caps, exclamation point on Truth Social. Eric Larson's been waiting for this ruling just like we have. Reporting for Bloomberg, our legal reporter who spent many days in a criminal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, following Donald Trump through his legal saga, now to this ruling by the Supreme Court. Eric, it's great to see you. Donald Trump is spinning this as good news. Can we qualify it as such?
I suppose it is, in that you mentioned this trial is now very unlikely to happen before the election, and we know that Trump has said that if he wins the election, he would use the power of the presidency to direct the Justice Department to throw out this case. But more generally speaking, Trump did want this entire case thrown out. He argued that everything he did around January 6th and the election was protected by immunity, and the court did not go that far. These charges remain. So at least one of the charges, or some of the allegations now, probably cannot be used in court. The Supreme Court said that some of Trump's communications with the Attorney General at the time around the election, trying to get the Justice Department to back his election fraud claims, which they did not do. Some of that is an official act and probably cannot be used in the case now going forward. But a lot of the other conduct alleged in the indictment is going to potentially be private conduct, in which means that those charges could go to trial. And so it's not a total win for Trump here, but this case survives and goes forward.
It does indeed, and I guess the appeals court will now have to create some sort of a test or a way to delineate what counts as official and what does not. Is that the next phase?
Yes. Here? Yeah. Eventually, Judge Chutkan in Washington is going to restart this long-stalled case. We'll probably have to have something like a mini trial to have Jack Smith, the special counsel, come in and argue, give fresh evidence, maybe even have testimony from experts to explain why these allegations were private conduct by a losing presidential candidate and not by a president. So they're going to have to explain to the judge in more detail why some of these actions just simply were not protected by immunity. And depending on how she rules eventually on that, it's likely that this case could find its way back to the Supreme Court. And they'll have to decide whether she was correct in deciding what was official versus private. And if any of the charges survive that, then eventually we'll have a trial.
Boy, okay. But again, if Donald Trump is reelected, he could essentially defund this entire exercise. Is that the way he would bring it to an end?
I believe so. If he wins the election, it's not as if he can just on day one order the Justice Department to do this. He's going to have to find, he's going to have to get an Attorney General in place. There are steps he's going to have to go through to have the prosecution thrown out. But certainly that is something that he will try to do. So of course, everything hinges for him on whether he wins the election or not.
Eric, it's great to have you. Big day. Eric Larson, Bloomberg legal reporter. Appreciate the insights and a ruling that is just not even 2 hours old here, coming from the Supreme Court on what is now officially the last day of the term. This was the parting shot, as the Chief Justice suggested. Adding the voice now of Robert McWhirter. Been looking forward to this. Criminal and constitutional law attorney. We spent many hours talking about Donald Trump's criminal charges in Lower Manhattan. This is a whole different can of worms here as we turn to the Supreme Court, and Robert has an expertise in constitutional law. It's great to have you back here, Robert. I want to point you to the SEAL Team 6 argument, because I'm trying to understand what we really just learned here. And I know that this is going to go back down to the appeals court, but you remember Trump's attorney, John Sauer, was asked in the throes of arguments here in April, if in fact the presidents had immunity, couldn't they then dispatch SEAL Team 6 to kill a political opponent? He said a qualified yes to that. So could Joe Biden, now that we've got the ruling here, direct SEAL Team 6 to start killing his opponents?
Well, yeah, and let me show you how I could create it as part of an official act. Let's say that in all the documents that they found that Trump had squirreled away down at Mar-a-Lago, and he finds some indication that he was going to give those to Vladimir Putin so he could open a hotel in Moscow, Joe Biden could declare as part of his official duties that Donald Trump is a threat, and he could eliminate that threat. And as part of his official duties, he could no longer be prosecuted. And according to the Supreme Court's argument, if he was ever prosecuted later for acts that were determined not to be official duties, they can't even refer to acts that he did as part of his official duties. I'll give you another example. The Supreme Court opinion said that the conversations Trump had with the Department of Justice, where he talked about overturning the election, that, according to the Supreme Court, is part of official duties, even though Donald Trump was talking about overturning a fair and free election and instigating an insurrection. And so not only can he not be prosecuted for anything that's, quote, an official duty, things that arguably happen within the context of being president, like talking to an attorney general, even though it's talking about an insurrection and implementing an insurrection or a coup, could not even come in as evidence in a later case.
It's incredible. So I guess I'm left asking, what doesn't count as an official action? If you're the president and you're thinking it and talking about it, where do we draw the line?
Well, okay, stuff that he does outside of the scope of being president. So, for instance, the Stormy Daniels case, if it would have been federal, would not count. Stuff he does afterwards, presumably, and it's a big presumably, that let's say Donald Trump, while he was president, made a deal to put up a hotel someplace and he fraudulently bilked a bunch of investors or something like that. The court says that the presumption is that it's part of his official duties, but a prosecutor could then fight against that presumption and bring a case. But it's presumably part of official duties, but supposedly he could do that. If Donald Trump decided to shoot somebody down Fifth Avenue, like he's bragged that he could do, if it's during the time he's president, it probably could be prosecuted, but the prosecutor has to beat the presumption that it's not part of the official duties. The prosecutor now has the burden of proof to show it's not part of the official duties rather than the other way around.
To think that we're back to shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue, this can't be real. All right, I've got a lot of questions for you, Robert. I'm supposed to tell everybody that this indefinitely delays, I already did, this indefinitely delays Jack Smith's trial because smart people like you have suggested as much along the way. But why can't the judge, why not just start the trial right now and answer some of these questions about official acts during the trial? The Supreme Court doesn't say anything that would bar that from happening, does it?
Well, the Supreme Court actually did. What they did is they said it has to be remanded to the lower court for proceedings to determine whether this was or was not an official act, which means they have to have a pre-trial evidentiary hearing, which could take weeks, if not months, to determine and make a legal ruling whether whatever Donald Trump was part of an official act. And of course, every time the judge makes a ruling against Donald Trump, that ruling can now be appealed again to the higher courts, which takes time. So actually, the Supreme Court has baked in a complete delay for whatever happens, because you just can't go to the jury now and say this should be a jury question. The Supreme Court pretty clearly said this is a legal question for judges to determine.
So that is why the ruling today is so important politically. We're talking to a legal mind right now. And by the way, Robert's a pretty good political analyst from the conversations we've had. But that is one of the most important things that you're going to hear today. I wonder your thoughts on the dissent from Justice Sotomayor. It makes a mockery of the principle foundation to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. Is she right?
Yeah, she is right. You know, the country began with the Declaration of Independence. I may have made this point before. And the Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. After that, it goes through what's basically an indictment of the executive, King George III. And one of those bases for indictments for reason why King George should not be our sovereign anymore, our executive leader, is because, quote, he has incited domestic insurrection among us, end quote. When we wrote the Constitution as a country, when this country did it with the founding fathers, they did not want executives to have this kind of power. The president actually has very few powers under the Constitution. Most powers a president exercises are by acts of Congress, which he is obligated to execute as part of the executive branch. So I think Justice Sotomayor is absolutely correct, as are the other three dissenters. And Justice Amy Coney Barrett, in her concurrence, also said on that point about not letting juries hear what the president did during his official acts as it could reflect on his later criminal conduct. She was right as well in that part. She joined the dissenters. So they are correct on this in terms of the country that our framers wanted to correct. Remember, we didn't want King George III. And what this immunity does is exactly what the king had. And that's why we didn't create our country that way.
Yet here we are, Robert, and I wonder your thoughts then on the timeline. Judge Chutkan previously said she would allow 3 months to prepare for a trial that could last 2 to 3 months in duration. There's no chance this is going to happen, or are we going to find ourselves with potentially a president-elect on trial?
We could find ourselves with a president-elect on trial, but realize the moment he becomes president, he can shut the whole thing down. So presumably, if they could get in, before January of 2025, they could probably do it. But I don't even see how that happens. Look, there's an old saying among lawyers that, any lawyer can win on good facts, but it takes a real lawyer to win on procedure. Donald Trump's winning on procedure, and so are his lawyers. And they have a willing and able Supreme Court that's right in their pocket to do it. And that's what's happened.
That's amazing. So kudos to Donald Trump's legal team.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. They had a good environment, though. I mean, look, the D.C. Court of Appeals, 3 rather conservative judges on the D.C. Court of Appeals disposed of this case quickly, and the Supreme Court could have let that sit. It could have waited for another case where somebody brings some absurd kind of argument against a president or a former president. For instance, some county attorney someplace could say, oh, Joe Biden has been criminal in his actions of not defending the United States border. That could have been a case that could have gone up to define some of the boundaries of presidential immunity. This case is what almost amounts to what we call an advisory opinion, which Supreme Court is not supposed to do. The Supreme Court doesn't give you opinions about what the law should be. It decides the cases and controversies that come before it. They actually reached down and created the case to bring up on this and to give this expansive power, which is nowhere in the Constitution. You will not find one word in the United States Constitution about presidential immunity.
That's correct. Immunity nowhere to be found. Take it from Robert McWhirter. I'm sure glad you could talk to us today, Robert. Many thanks for being with us, criminal and constitutional law attorney, keeping us honest here at Bloomberg. Just the person we needed to hear from now. As we turn from the legal to the political side here, we've got a great panel lined up for you here. The best Bloomberg in Washington, Wendy Benjaminson and Jordan Fabian with the view from the White House and the campaign. It's next, only on Bloomberg.
Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green right now. S&P advancing 11 points to 54.72. That is a gain now of just about 0.2%. The Dow up 57, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up another 115 points, up by 0.6%. Treasuries are being hit as traders weigh U.S. election risks. 10-year at 4.46%. The 2-year, 4.76%. Again, the 10-year, 4.46%. Gold up 0.2%, 23.31 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude now up 1.7%, 82.95 a barrel. NVIDIA shares have turned around. They're up 0.8%. French antitrust regulators are preparing to charge NVIDIA over alleged anti-competitive practices. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Again, recapping, S&P up 11 right now, a gain of 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. We knew it would be an important day today with the Supreme Court ruling, and that certainly is the case. The Supreme Court says Donald Trump does, in fact, have some immunity, kicking down this immunity claim to the appeals court, as you've been hearing on Bloomberg now for the better part of 2 hours. We got this ruling a short time ago from the Supreme Court. So the trial's delayed, and a lot of questions about the impact on the campaign trail. Realizing a lot of this stuff is unquantifiable, but we have two smart minds who cover this every day with us right now, who you know and trust from the program, Jordan Fabian, White House correspondent, and Wendy Benjaminson, Bloomberg Washington senior editor. Great to see you both on a pretty momentous day. Yeah. And I'm making the point repeatedly, not just for Donald Trump, for the presidency, as you cover it, Jordan. Talk to us about the bigger picture here, because everyone's trying to connect the dots to this campaign, but this is a broader story that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, some of us were joking, not to belie the seriousness of this, that, now, there's no way that Donald Trump can lock up Joe Biden if he wins the November election. I mean, it does have a lot of consequences here. The Supreme Court saying that official acts are off limits from prosecution, and that the court would even have to look, lower courts would have to look at, what qualifies as an official act, as Donald Trump tried to overturn an election that he lost. I mean, that is a seismic moment in the United States, and it certainly gives more power to the presidency, makes it less accountable to other branches of government, including Congress and namely the federal courts, which they rule on today.
It's really well put, Wendy. We were just talking with Robert McWhirter about the SEAL Team 6 factor. This came up during arguments about whether a president in his or her official duty could mobilize SEAL Team 6 to go off a political opponent. And Donald Trump's attorney said without first being impeached by the Senate, the answer is a qualified yes. Now, no one thinks that's about to happen, but if you start to bring this down a little bit, maybe your imagination's working today. Robert said, what if Joe Biden took a look at some of the documents in Donald Trump's basement and read about this hotel he wanted to open in Moscow and decided that that was a national security threat? He would, based on today's ruling, be clear to do something about that, to actually go after Donald Trump legally or militarily or whatever it would be, and that's legal.
Right.
This is a game changer.
Right. This is the one thing that I think Jordan started to make the point on, and I firmly agree with. These Supreme Court rulings, I mean, we're all talking about the effect on Trump and the effect on the 2024 campaign. These decisions last for decades, unless they're overturned, but that's not going to happen probably in our lifetime. And so, yes, this means that if Joe Biden wins, he can go after Donald Trump in some ways, and that he can do things that are outside the scope. I mean, to me, this ruling is the first step, going back to just the Trump presidency. If Trump wins, Trump wants to very much strengthen the executive power in this country. And now the Supreme Court is behind him in that. It's giving him tremendous power, not only over the government, but his own actions. He's really not bound by much. He just needs to come up with a constitutional reason for doing something.
Isn't that something? So we've established here this is a BFD. With regard to the campaign, it's kind of a dotted line, Jordan, coming off of this difficult debate on Thursday night for Joe Biden. There's a conversation about whether he should even be the nominee in Chicago in August. I think this is broadly viewed as strengthening Donald Trump's hand, but does it actually move the needle? Do we have polling to support that? Do we have a sense of the impact on the race?
I think it's too early to tell, Joe. And, I will point out that, for all the hullabaloo about the debate, and it certainly raised some real concerns, it didn't necessarily change the contours of the race, which is we have a president for whom there are serious concerns about age and acuity, and then another former president who voters have concerns about, his legal conduct, his, so where we were both of these things are kind of affirming and sort of entrenching those dynamics. Now, I will say the fact that this ruling came today, it does strengthen Donald Trump's hand. He doesn't have to worry about another trial before November. He can have a freer hand to schedule campaign events and rallies. But it also helps Joe Biden change the subject. And now Joe Biden can talk about the danger of reelecting Donald Trump for all the reasons we just talked about, that he would have this free hand to benefit himself, pursue his political enemies without fear of prosecution. So that's something they've been really hungry for since Thursday, and the Supreme Court handed it to them today.
That's really interesting. The idea being here that this Jack Smith trial will be delayed maybe indefinitely. If Trump gets reelected, he can kind of wipe this whole thing out. Is that the actual upside? Is that he now will not likely stand trial for the January 6 charges?
That's certainly the upside until the election is decided. And is just to cue off Jordan's point there, the Biden campaign will say, here's another data point that Trump is too dangerous. Here's another reason, as they've been trying to do since Thursday night, as they've been trying to do since the beginning of this campaign. This is a binary choice in their minds between good and evil. The trouble is they cannot seem to make that argument stick. And as long as clips of Thursday night are still playing, it's still going to be an uphill battle to convince America that, as the Democrats want to, that Trump is dangerous for the country.
I'm guessing we don't get an official White House statement on this. Does that fall to the campaign, Jordan?
Yeah, the campaign just conducted a call with reporters where a bunch of surrogates were sounding off on this, talking about all the things we've just been talking about.
What did you hear?
They were the thrust of their argument is again pointing out how dangerous Donald Trump, unaccountable to the federal courts, could be. They had Harry Dunn, who was that U.S. Capitol Police officer who ran an unsuccessful campaign for Congress, as well as some current Democratic lawmakers who were, and some of them who were in the Capitol on January 6th. So could speak from personal experience about what that day was like, and then pointing out, raising the fact that Donald Trump has promised to be a dictator on day one, that he, during that debate, when we were all focused on Biden's stumbling performance, that he refused to say he would accept the results of the November election. So again, just another opportunity for them to point all these out. And as Wendy smartly pointed out, the question is whether they can get it to stick with voters.
Well, it's interesting, the argument that you lay out here, because what's Joe Biden's campaign, or what will Joe Biden really be saying? Here's another reason to fear Trump's even more dangerous than you thought, or you need to fear the court too. And I'm the only thing protecting you from them. Is that the real message here?
That's certainly part of the message.
Because that's pretty wild if that's the world we're in.
Yeah, it is. It's extremely wild. And that is what, yes, I think that Biden can say, this ruling strengthens the powers of the presidency to go beyond what most people think is acceptable behavior. Donald Trump will break that barrier and go beyond what is acceptable behavior, the Biden campaign would say. But Joe Biden, stalwart, nice old guy, will not. That he will stick within the guardrails and you can trust him to do that. That's an okay argument, except for Thursday night, except for the debate. If we hadn't seen that awful performance, then I think that argument might begin to have some stick. But he was convicted on 34 felonies, and as Donald Trump pointed out Thursday night, it didn't hurt him.
Yes,
so.
There seemed to be a big CYA up at Camp David over the weekend, the family members pointing to those who prepped Joe Biden for the debate, and there was reporting over the weekend that he over-prepared him. He had a nice summer tan going. He looked all pasty when he came out. The makeup was wrong. He wasn't treated or protected properly. Is that going to be the takeaway from debate one?
I highly doubt it. I mean, look, there's obviously this circular firing squad going on the Democratic side. We can't lose sight of the fact that it was Joe Biden and his team who wanted this debate. It was Joe Biden's team that agreed to and pushed for the terms of this debate. microphones muted, no studio audience. This is everything they wanted. They got it on a silver platter, and they couldn't deliver. So for his family to blame his advisors and CNN, it doesn't ring true. I mean, the person most to blame here is Joe Biden, that he did not deliver the performance he needed to deliver in the moment when he needed it most.
Yet the message is he's going nowhere. Does that conversation start to change maybe when we get a vice presidential announcement from Trump? By the way, I'm thinking that could be any minute after this, right?
Actually, what we were thinking in the room this morning was that Donald Trump will let the Biden debate story keep going.
How about that?
Why distract anyone from the Biden should drop out storyline with a vice presidential nominee?
There's
so
some
he can
logic
put this
there.
off for a couple of weeks.
I guess it depends to the extent that people read into this or want to forget about it. I don't know, but it would be a nice answer to this ruling, I have to admit. But are we really talking about new names here? I mean, Barack Obama sent out that tweet on Friday saying Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. When does the backroom conversation reach?
I don't know.
Or doesn't it?
I'm not sure it does. Everything we're seeing is that Biden and the people closest to him, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his sister, and these top aides, think he should stay in the race, or at least that is what they are all saying, both to him and out loud. It's everyone else. And I have no idea, but I find it a little hard to believe that guys like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who are campaign geniuses, really, whatever you think about their policies, aren't grabbing him by the lapels and saying, Joe, come on, really?
Well, we're out of time, Jordan. Is that meeting going to happen? Everyone's asking who's the Barry Goldwater here.
We'll see if it happens. Look,
you have to remember back here.
Yeah, like Joe Biden is a stubborn guy, and we've seen throughout history that the more people push against him and say, Joe, you shouldn't do this or that, he's going to go in the opposite direction. It's only going to cost him.
So I'll meet you in Chicago.
Exactly.
Jordan Fabian, Wendy Benjaminson, great conversation. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we bring you up to date now. Ahead of our political panel on world and national news, Amy Morris has that from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. The U.S. Supreme Court, as you were just talking about, ruled Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results, all but ensuring that a trial won't happen before the November election. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts says the nature of presidential power entitles an ex-president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, but he says there's no immunity for unofficial acts. The Supreme Court has extended the delay in the Washington criminal case against Trump on charges that he plotted to overturn the 2020 election. Besides the presidential immunity decision, the Supreme Court also wrapped up its term with a couple of other key rulings.
In a 6-3 vote, the justices ruled that a convenience store in North Dakota can sue over debit card swipe fees that were imposed more than a decade ago because the business opened within the 6-year statute of limitations. This decision could make a raft of long-standing federal rules newly vulnerable under the Federal Administrative Procedure Act. And in a unanimous decision, the High Court sent a pair of cases related to new social media laws in Texas and Florida back to lower courts. The justices say there's not enough information on how the laws would apply to companies like Google and Meta Platforms. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
And this is Bloomberg.
1240 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P right now up 12. That is a gain of just about 0.2%. Dow Industrials holding on to a 79-point gain for the Dow, up now by 0.2%. NASDAQ is up 118 points for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain now of 0.7%. 10-year 4.47% with a 2-year 4.77%. Gold up $2 the ounce, little change, $23.28 now, up by just under 0.1%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.7%, $82.96 a barrel. Wall Street, meanwhile, is awaiting a major economic report from the Labor Department. That'll be the monthly jobs report. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
We'll get June's data on Friday. In May, unemployment rose to 4%, the highest since 2022, and it probably held there in June. High interest rates aimed at stemming inflation appear to be weighing on economic growth as intended by Federal Reserve officials. To add a little perspective, 4% unemployment is much better than the pandemic when it reached 14.8%, the highest since the Great Depression. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Briefly, Tesla is expected to report another quarter of weaker sales tomorrow. Tesla shares now up by 6.2%. And sources tell Bloomberg Teva Pharmaceutical Industries is being investigated by the FTC over patents for certain drugs, including asthma inhalers. Teva, little changed, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host. Here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Would otherwise be a sleepy Monday here in Washington, the 1st of July. Rabbit, by the way. But we got busy early on knowing that the Supreme Court was ending its term. And of course, well, they saved the big one for last, and that's the immunity claim put forth by Donald Trump. Interesting ruling by not really ruling. They're kicking it back down to an appeals court to determine what qualifies as an official action by the president. After all this time, the months they sat on this, they're kicking it back down to another court. And that means Jack Smith cannot start his trial, even if he'll eventually be able to. It's indefinitely delayed as the case is remanded back to the appeals court. Chuck Schumer with one end of this, and you shouldn't be surprised to hear this from the Democratic leader in the U.S. Senate. A sad day for our democracy. Quote, the very basis of our judicial system is that no one is above the law. Treason or indictment of an insurrection should not be considered a core constitutional power afforded to a president, which is kind of what the court is implying here, right? If it's an official duty, by God, just think what you could do. Donald Trump himself, Truth Social. This is interesting. Today's historic decision by the Supreme Court should end all of crooked Joe Biden's witch hunts against me, including the New York hoaxes. He is more specific. The Manhattan scam cooked by Soros-backed DA Alvin Bragg, racist New York Attorney General Tish James's shameless attack on the amazing business that I have built, and the fake Bergdorf's case, he says. That's the E. Jean Carroll one he was actually found liable in. Proud to be an American, all caps. It's funny that when you think about this, he wasn't president when any of these offenses took place, so today's ruling would have absolutely no bearing on that. What bearing does this ruling have on the presidential race? Can anyone answer that? I know there's some polling out there, but this is pretty much unquantifiable. The fact that Trump won't stand trial, a January 6th trial ahead of the election, that's kind of the one thing we can wrap our arms around, but there's more to it than that. And coming off of Thursday's debate, well, there's a lot of noise in the air, and that's why we have our great panel. Rick Davis with the clutch analysis earlier today on Bloomberg Politics contributor, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Republican strategist, joined today by Brad Howard, the Democratic strategist, back with us, Corcoran Street Group founder and president. Great to see both you gentlemen with us, and welcome back to Bloomberg. Rick, you've had a minute to digest this whole thing. Can we actually say that there's an impact on the campaign, or that this is basically status quo? People knew about Donald Trump's legal worries yesterday, and this doesn't change any of them, does it?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it gives both sides a talking point. Obviously, the Trump side are going to claim credit that what he did wasn't a violation of law because he was protected by the immunity of the presidency, and so it does give him I think, something to say about this case that he otherwise wasn't going to be in the position of saying. And I don't think it's going to change the Biden side to where they, have claimed all along that he's subject to prosecution and he was trying to subvert an election. If anything, I would think it gives the Biden folks a chance to say more about it. They've been very deferential to the Supreme Court and the federal judges overseeing these. And so Donald Trump's really been the only message point out there. So maybe this unleashes a torrent of response by the Biden folks, but we haven't really seen much of it today. So from a political perspective, I think the microphone now goes to Judge Chutkan. And from a talking point perspective, regardless of the legal side, she may weigh in pretty heavily against Donald Trump's position on this as far as his culpability during the January 6th attack of the Capitol and subsequent efforts to subvert the election. So there may be more to this than I think Trump particularly wanted to have happen post Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, that would really inform the debate here and the analysis if we do, in fact, hear from Judge Chutkan. In the meantime, Brad, I'm curious about how the voter is moved or not by any of this. Pramila Jayapal, who chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus, called it disastrous, blamed the extreme right-wing Supreme Court, weakening accountability if a president attempts to use their office for criminal purposes. Does the White House need to start talking about this, Brad? Because so far they're leaving it to the campaign.
Well, look, I think since the founding of our republic that everyone has been concerned about an unaccountable, powerful executive. I mean, I'm at the end of the day an Article I supremacist. I think anything not enumerated specifically in the Constitution to the executive branch should be done by the legislative branch. And so I have problems with, executive orders that I think are policy that should be laws, not executive order, and et cetera. But this is different. This is, I think for most Americans, this should be scary. I mean, this is what we're talking about here is the leader of the free world, the most powerful man or woman on the planet is able to do whatever they want without fear of criminal prosecution when they leave office. And even if they do something that's perceived as personal, but they're making the argument that it is official, that debate has to go to trial. And a judge has to either, Congress has to impeach, and we know Congress can never get 2/3 to do anything like remove a president from office. But again, just the evidence you're hearing alone, trying to determine what's official versus unofficial, is going to be a legal nightmare that could keep a president from, away from prosecution for years, if not a decade. So, this is a very dangerous thing. And there's an understanding that the president needs to make decisions about what's best for national security and not worry about kind of legal or criminal prosecution of himself in that capacity. But this takes it to the extreme. And I think it's the first time it's ever been kind of written out. So any president that comes into office now knows that they're free from having been locked up afterwards. And if they can just convince a judge or a jury that it was an official act.
What Brad is saying is largely true here, Rick, until, of course, this is qualified by the lower court. Maybe we will find that, as was heard in the arguments in April, a president directing SEAL Team 6 to kill a political opponent might, in fact, be crossing the line. But if you're a voter and you're waking up today on a Monday in July trying to figure out what the court just said, should you be more worried about Donald Trump or the Supreme Court?
Well, it is interesting that the entire debate today, since the court ruled, has assumed that Donald Trump's going to be president. I mean, it's kind of interesting that it wasn't that he did these things while he was president. Sure, and that's going to be prosecuted. And that's up to Judge Chutkan, and she's already made very clear how she feels about his official versus non-official acts. So we kind of have a pretty good roadmap as to where that's going to go. But all the other hyperbolic kind of statements about going after your opponents and things like that is assuming that it's Donald Trump in the presidency. I mean, it basically gives a hunting license to Joe Biden. He's currently president and will be for the next 6 months. And so I think it's interesting that nobody is raising the specter that, oh my God, what is it that Joe Biden might do while he's still president that would be covered under criminal offenses protected by immunity? So I get why everybody's worried about Donald Trump. But it is interesting that it's almost like nobody really even cares about the fact that we have a sitting president who's now been empowered by the Supreme Court with what is once thought to be assumed immunity is now explicit.
Yeah. Well, and I will just note for accuracy, I opened this hour by asking Robert McWhirter if Joe Biden today could dispatch SEAL Team 6 to go after Donald Trump. And Brad, that's kind of what we heard from the court, isn't it?
Great, but let me back up something Rick said. It's not that people are talking about this because they think Donald Trump is going to win. It's because Donald Trump is the only one in the history of the Republic, maybe since Nixon, that has indicated that he will go to the extreme like this. So that's why we're worried about Trump and not Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a good, decent human being and has had a record of respecting the courts and respecting the turnout and the results of elections. That's why this is dangerous. We have a dangerous man on the precipice of the White House that could win, and that's why people are concerned. And if you go back to Amy Coney Barrett's concurring opinion, in there she actually gives an opening for Jack Smith's case where she says specifically that the alleged crime of appointing fake electors to interfere with an election is not an official act. She says it's unofficial, and therefore he could be held criminally liable. So the Republicans about dismissing Jack Smith's case, Amy Coney Barrett clearly states that she thinks that that case can continue. I think the problem is the debate over the ruling, and the court ruling also said that any evidence obtained or that was done in an official capacity cannot be used to prosecute a former president in an unofficial capacity. That evidentiary hearing alone could take years, depending on document by document.
And they remanded it officially back to the appeals court. But Brad, would we be having the same conversation today if Thursday had gone differently? We just spent all weekend reading about the circular firing squad, as Jordan Fabian called it, in the Democratic Party. The families now blaming the folks who prepared Joe Biden. There were people on our air saying Joe Biden lost the election on Thursday night. Is that also a bit why people are looking to Donald Trump here?
No, I don't buy that at all. I think when you look at even the results that we're seeing in the polling that comes out, the shift in his numbers have been among base voters. Swing voters are not paying attention. And by the way, swing voters have had concern about his age from the beginning. This is why they're swing right now. They're undecided, is because they know he's old. They think he's too old to be president, and the president's got to convince them that he's not and that he's up to the task. What has never really happened is the base has always been defending the president. And I think, me included, the base saw in his performance for the first time the visual representation of the weakness of his age. And so the president right now has got to spend the next 2 to 4 weeks assuring us of our concerns and not dismissing them and showing that he's up to the task. I think the rally afterwards was a good start, the Waffle House visit, things like that. By the way, the debate had like 20 million viewers. I think that TikTok with the president in the Waffle House got 22 million viewers on TikTok versus the debate, which got like 20 million. So there's ways to recover from this, but he's got to assure the base. And no, I think all along, Democrats have always understood that Trump could win. And that's why we're working our tails off to make sure Biden wins.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting, Rick, having prepared presidential candidates, in your case, John McCain and a few others, for a presidential debate like that, to see the folks who are preparing the president to be blamed like this. Interesting tweet from John Favreau, the former Obama speechwriter and advisor. He's now got a very popular podcast, reacting to this CBS News poll showing an increased number of voters, including many Democrats, think Joe Biden should not be running for president. I would simply say, calling nearly half your party's voters the bedwetting brigade, Favreau writes, is not the most effective strategy to assuage their concerns about your candidate and get them to the polls. What do you think of the CYA at Camp David over the weekend, Rick, blaming the preparers for the debate?
Yeah, somebody had to get blamed, and they weren't going to blame the president for the poor performance. But at the end of the day, he's the only one who's paying a price for it. None of them are losing their job, but Joe Biden will likely lose his job because of that debate performance. I mean, I respect the fact that he showed up at the Waffle House a few hours later, seemingly in much better condition. So what happened? I mean, like, why did he show up at Waffle House where nobody really cares what he does other than order blueberry pancakes with syrup? And instead, he shows up at the debate, which was critical to his own campaign strategy, which is why he thought it up to begin with, incredibly poorly prepared and exhausted and sick. and puts in the worst debate performance in the history of modern politics. So he's got only one way to look at that, and that's his
Or as
fault.
we're hearing now, was he over-prepared? Rick Davis and Brad Howard are back in our second hour. Brad has his take on this, so does Rick. That's why I'm glad they're both with us today as we dissect the ruling from the Supreme Court and try to understand its impacts in November. Stay with us for the second hour of Balance of Power.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's a ruling that impacts Donald Trump's legal journey, but also the presidency at large. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the Supreme Court rules today on Donald Trump's immunity claims without actually ruling. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington, and a very important day here in politics and, of course, in Supreme Court history. Kaylee remanding this case back down to the appeals court. Big questions now about whether there will be a Jack Smith trial ever.
Yeah, it's entirely possible this ruling on 6-3 partisan lines from the high court could effectively mean that this will not go to trial before the election in November. The court, of course, finding that Donald Trump indeed does have some immunity for official acts, but not for unofficial ones. And this is the question. To what extent was Donald Trump acting as president versus as a presidential candidate? And to your point, Joe, the court actually not deciding on what constitutes what in terms of official versus unofficial acts. They've tossed it back down to another court to decide.
Yeah, so questions remain about whether anything crosses the line for a sitting president if it's under the guise of an official act, remembering the SEAL Team 6 argument that in this world a president could then feasibly activate SEAL Team 6 to go after a political opponent. And after what we learned from the court, that remains a question.
Absolutely. And that was really at the heart of the dissent that was authored by Sonia Sotomayor, the justice. She says, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of the office to violate criminal law. And she ended by saying, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. And that really gets down to the root of this, Joe. This obviously does have implications for the prosecution of Donald Trump, but its implications go well beyond him to the current president and all presidents to come, realistically.
Yeah, so we're going to explore the legal side of this and the political side over the next hour, as you would expect here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm glad to say the former Deputy U.S. Attorney General and former Deputy Solicitor General of the United States, Donald Ayer, is going to be with us. This is someone who has been there arguing cases before the court, and our great panel as well. Kaylee, Rick Davis, and Brad Howard will bring us the view from both sides of the aisle here in the throes of a presidential campaign.
Yeah, we've got a lot of important conversations coming up. First, though, as always, let's get a check on the markets up in New York with Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. We got equities moving higher. Right now, we have got the S&P higher by 10, up by about 0.2%. Traders, however, certainly weighing the potential economic implications of the November presidential election. S&P, as I mentioned, up 0.2. We've got the Dow up 0.1% right now, up 58 points, while NASDAQ is up 119, a gain of 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.48%, the 2-year 4.78%. Gold right now, little changed, up just about $1 the ounce. Spot gold at $23.37, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.9%, $83.07 a barrel. Boeing has agreed to buy back Spirit AeroSystems Holdings for $37.25 a share in an all-stock deal that values the supplier at $4.7 billion, unwinding a 2-decade separation as the embattled playmaker tries to fix its manufacturing defects. Boeing shares up right now by 2.2%. Shares of SPR, Spirit AeroSystems Holdings, they're up by 3.5%. Recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 10 now, a gain of 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York. Thank you so much. I am Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where all of the focus today is on a ruling that just came out from the Supreme Court. The last day of a term that extended into July. And at the very last moment, the last opinion comes down, and it's a big one. The High Court ruling 6-3 that Donald Trump does have some immunity from prosecution for official acts he took during his presidency. But Chief Justice John Roberts, Joe, writing in his majority opinion, the president is not above the law. I guess it's just a question of to what extent.
Yeah, and where's the line? What's official? And I guess we're going to go through this exercise now, Kaylee, to truly delineate what counts, and that's going to take a while, which is why it's likely now that Jack Smith's trial will not be able to take place before the election, and if Donald Trump wins the election, it probably will never take place at all. It's where we start our conversation with Donald Ayer, a very important voice in this story you've heard before here on Bloomberg TV and radio, the former Deputy U.S. Attorney General and former Principal Deputy Solicitor General of the United States. Donald, welcome back to the table. It's really great to see you, and thank you for being here on this day of days. I think we have to start by acknowledging the fact that once again, this court didn't really rule in its ruling. It simply remanded this back down to a lower court. What the heck took so long?
Well, I don't know, and one can speculate about motives and why and all.
They're
the
already
delay,
speculating.
And I mean, there's a lot one can say, but I think probably for now, having just a couple hours ago gotten this, 3 hours ago gotten this decision, it's probably worth talking about what the decision is and says. And I guess what I would say is that it's got a plausible framework and a very pro-immunity spin to it. Court basically starts out, saying that conduct within the outer perimeter of duties is presumptively subject to immunity, and that conduct that's not within the outer perimeter of duties is not. And then you get into the question of what is and what is not within the outer perimeter of the duties. And the court ends up taking a very broad view of what is within the outer perimeter of the duties. And they do it in part by looking at specific allegations within the Trump indictment and in the January 6th case. And we can go through that if you want to in terms of what they said. And what they ended up saying was, geez, effectively, there's possibilities that a lot of the things alleged could be subject to immunity.
Well, and so that gets down to the delineation between official acts and unofficial acts and what exactly could be prosecuted. But what's noteworthy is the court today also ruled that even evidence regarding official acts cannot be incorporated into a trial whenever, if ever, that takes place. How consequential is that part of the ruling, that not only the prosecution is in question, but what you can enter into your arguments if you're a prosecutor?
It's quite consequential, and it's I think, highly questionable, because as Justice Sotomayor said in her dissent, and as Amy Coney Barrett said in her concurrence, this is not what the law is. That's not what it's been. I think more consequential is the way the court spun the questions about what is, two things, what is within the outer perimeter, and secondly, if it is within the outer perimeter and therefore presumptively subject to immunity, how do you decide whether there is immunity or not? And in both of those ways, the court has sort of set this thing at an angle that makes you think, and then the other thing is they're going to get the last word. They're going to get the last word because this is going to be bounced back to the district court. Yeah. District court's going to have hearings. It's going to answer these questions that the court has said have to be answered. Then it's going to go back up on appeal. And if the court
why not just answer it now?
How what?
Why wouldn't the Supreme Court just make those delineations itself, knowing it'll ultimately come back to them anyway?
Well, they did in one instance do that. They made a ruling that the former president's actions with regard to the Attorney General, the DOJ situation, where he has control of who's the Attorney General, and he took some steps to replace the Attorney General, and he leaned on the Attorney General to send a letter to Georgia and stuff like that. And essentially, the court said, well, that's within the outer perimeter of his duties. Clearly, he's in charge of the Justice Department. But with regard to three other categories of conduct, the court basically said things that said, well, it could be subject to immunity, and we're going to remand it. But those categories are indicative of, really? That's really subject possibly to immunity? And so it puts a spin on it that causes one to wonder really how accountable the president can be within this framework.
That's a great way of putting it. And I wonder broadly, when you consider the fact that we're even having this conversation now, the American experiment rejected the idea of having a king. Now, I realize you still need to be elected, but it kind of sounds like you're a king for 4 years. Is that not right?
Well, let's hope not. But that's a spin one could put and wonder if it isn't true, because it depends a lot on how these issues turn out. I mean, for example, one of the categories that they focused on was the allegations, which we're all familiar with, about Trump interfering with, calling state officials, calling local officials, trying to influence the state vote count, which is the job of the states to do. It's not the federal job. It's not his job. It's not arguably really within the scope of any job he's got, unless you think he's in charge of everything. And the court said, well, that could be within the outer perimeter, so we'll remand that. Right. We'll send that back to the district court. The ultimate thing that they did that's most alarming, one of the most alarming things to me about it, is that for all these things that may be arguably within the outer perimeter of responsibility, which the court seems to think is very, very broad, including speeches given on January 6th, for example, communicating with the public. Well, that's the president's job, to communicate with the public. But so what's the test for deciding whether you're going to defeat this presumptive immunity for things that are within the scope, arguably, and it's whether a prosecution with regard to it, the quote from the case is, could pose any dangers of intrusions on the authority and function of the executive. Any dangers at all will justify immunity, according to the court.
Well, so when you consider the kinds of questions that were raised in the arguments back in April, one of them was, could the president tell SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? Under this framework that the court has just put forward, declaring that, including being commander-in-chief, that whatever you're doing in actions officially as president is prone to immunity, you could be immune from prosecution. Would that too be inclusive as we consider what anyone could do in the future?
You tell me. I mean, if the test is, would it, this is the only test the court provided, would it pose any danger of intrusion on the president's exercise of his powers? And if you apply that test, you tell me.
And in the case of Donald Trump, for instance, this was one example drawn by Robert McWhirter in our last hour. There are documents showing he talked to Russian authorities about opening a hotel in Moscow. If you decided that was a national security threat, that might fulfill the qualifier.
It could. And then just to stress the fact that what's been set up here, and this is getting to be a pattern when in the court's cases more broadly with regard to how ultimately issues are decided, they are centering more and more final authority on themselves with regard to administrative law issues. I mean, we've just experienced the repeal essentially of the Chevron doctrine, which recognized discretion in administrative agencies when the statute's ambiguous and they come up with a reasonable interpretation. Well, that's gone. And so it's going to be the courts that are going to decide what the statute means. Bump it up to us and we'll tell you. We'll tell you how to read that statute. Well, this is the same thing. Bump it up to us and we'll tell you whether or not this poses any danger to the exercise of discretion by the president. Well, good luck with that in terms of how that's going to turn out. It's going to turn out the way 5 justices want it to turn out.
That's right.
And right now, this group doesn't seem inclined to limit the president very much.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the other rulings that we have gotten from this court in this end of the term, because another one potentially relates to this case brought against Donald Trump in Washington last week, when they essentially limit the use of the Enron doctrine over what constitutes as obstruction in the case of a January 6th defendant that they ruled in favor of. Donald Trump has been charged with obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding in this very case that we are talking about. How do those two opinions intersect, if at all?
Well, again, ultimately, I hate to be cynical, but it's however this court says they interact. But if to try to analyze it, they decided that Fisher case on the ground that you should read the statute's 2 sections, one of which is about messing around with documents, and the other of which doesn't mention documents, but specifically, but just talks about interfering with an official proceeding, otherwise interfering with an official proceeding, which government, I think, totally persuasively argued meant apart from documents, did you interfere with the proceeding? Well, the court rejected that and said, no, you have to limit this along the lines of things to do with documents and evidence. Well, I think here, again, even that ruling, if you take it as at face value, when you apply it to the case of Trump and the indictment on these charges there, the allegations with regard to Trump are really allegations with regard to lots of things related to documents. They're related to these lists of electors that were submitted and other documentation that was included. And a reasonable reading would say, well, this comes within it anyway. Now, it depends specifically on what the prosecution intends to rely upon, but I think it could very well be fine even under that reading. But again, if it goes to the Supreme Court and they say it's not, and that's the end of it.
You referenced the fact that it says nothing about immunity and presidential immunity in the U.S. Constitution. Will there need to be language in the Constitution, an amendment that follows this, that clarifies this concept?
Well, I don't think there's any way practically, politically that could happen now. I think up until now, at least, most people have been comfortable. One of the trends of this court is a basic distrust, a public distrust of judges exercising judgment at the same time as, from year to year now we're experiencing the court, ironically, itself, just by fiat, deciding certain things are a certain way and just announcing them and saying them. And I think, everybody's understood that there is a concept of immunity that's very much a balancing process. It depends on judgment exercised by judges, and it starts with a premise that judges can be trusted to exercise judgment, and it's not an objective thing. It's not you read the word and say, well, that's what this is, and bingo, it's automatically true.
But wasn't it also based on the premise that even a president is not above the law?
Well, that's right.
In the United States? That's
right. I mean, that's the basic premise, and that's the thing I think that's so alarming to a lot of people about this decision, is that when you read it, it seems like a majority here is ready to let the president do a lot of things. And what is it that they're going to say is not within his outer perimeter of his duties?
In the dissent that Justice Sotomayor, which you've referenced, wrote, she ended it by saying she dissents with fear for our democracy.
Yeah.
Do you share that fear today?
Yeah, I do. Well, there's a lot of things that's happened lately that are causing fear for our democracy, because I think Donald Trump is someone who has, said all manner of things that would cause a lot of fear in terms of respecting elections and doing what he can to undermine them. And his whole campaign has been focused on the fact that the election was allegedly stolen from him, even though there's not a shred of evidence to support it. And he wants to be a dictator on day one, and all of this stuff, it's horrifying. And then you look at the polls, and he may well get that chance. And it's really, really scary.
Pretty remarkable to spend time with Donald Eyre on a day like this. We're really glad that you could come back to talk to us today on Bloomberg.
Thank you. Happy
Donald,
to do it.
thank you so much. Former Deputy U.S. Attorney General, former Principal Deputy Solicitor General of the United States, a man who knows what it's like to argue a case before the Supreme Court. Remarkable reaction to your last question there, Kaylee.
Yeah, concern for democracy not just being voiced by Mr. Eyre or Justice Sotomayor, but many in reaction to this ruling today. Not so, though, for Donald Trump himself, who, when this ruling came down, posted on Truth Social, "Big win for our Constitution and democracy. Proud to be an American." Of course, Trump not dealt a conclusive, decisive victory with this case, but certainly, if nothing else, a partial victory, because this is very unlikely to go to trial before the election.
That's right. So it remains kind of a dotted line to the campaign trail. We're going to talk about the impact on this race next with our panel, only on Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with a developing story. This headline right off the Bloomberg Professional Service. The Boston Celtics majority ownership group is planning to make the franchise available for sale. That according to ESPN. Again, developing story. The headline right now on the Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ are all advancing. S&P right now up 10 to 54.70, a gain there of 0.2%. The Dow up 74, up 0.2%. NASDAQ up 107, a gain there of 0.6%. 10-year yield 4.47% with a 2-year, 4.77%. The world's biggest bond market getting hit today as traders weigh the potential economic implications for the November presidential election. Gold up $1 the ounce, 23.27, a gain there of less than 0.1%. Crude, West Texas Intermediate, now up 2%, 83.19 a barrel. NVIDIA shares today trading lower by 0.2%. French antitrust regulators are preparing to charge NVIDIA over alleged anti-competitive practices. Again, this according to Reuters, citing sources. And repeating our top story, Boston Celtics majority ownership group planning to make the franchise available for sale. That according to ESPN. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you, and thank you for joining us on Bloomberg TV and Radio, the Monday edition of Balance of Power on this Supreme Court ruling day. It's the final day of the term, and the major ruling that we've been anticipating on presidential immunity dropped a few hours ago. There is still a lot of questions, though, about the impact of this ruling politically. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Kaylee, there are questions about the legal outcome of this ruling as well, because it's been remanded to a lower court, so we're not done with this yet.
No, it's going to be up to lower courts to decide what is an official act versus an unofficial act as we consider the powers of the presidency or the president himself as not just the leader of the United States and the free world, but also a private citizen engaging in private activity in some instances. And that's really the question that, to a large extent today, the court has left unanswered. What the court has succeeded in doing, though, is effectively making sure that this case brought against Donald Trump here in Washington will not go to trial before the election in November. So as we consider the consequence of this ruling and its impact on the election, we assemble our political panel. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor and partner at Stone Court Capital, together today with Brad Howard, Democratic strategist and Corcoran Street Group founder and president. Rick, just to begin with you, we can discuss whether or not this was a legal victory for Donald Trump, but certainly, can we call this a political one for him?
Sure. I think it's easily a political victory. He's been using it all day since the ruling was released to take a victory lap, claiming that he's been unfairly prosecuted and that he should be free of any of these charges because of this new immunity standard, one of which he claims he has said all along that he should have been immune. So, sure, he's making good use of it. I'm sure he'll raise money off of it. I'm sure he'll create some advantage with people who are Trump voters who are leaning the other way, potentially going against him. And so this might take one of the questions out of the matrix of issues they might have about concerns about Donald Trump.
Brad, does this go both ways? Is Joe Biden going to have a major fundraising week or day or quarter? In the end, we'll hear that Democratic donors were activated by this ruling?
I mean, I hope so, and I think it might, just simply because it dramatically raises the stakes of the election, right? It's no longer about, whether or not you think Joe Biden is maybe too old or Donald Trump is, too rambling at rallies. It's now about the survival of our democracy. Like, if you elect the wrong person with the wrong impulses here, there's no longer those checks and balances to prevent them from having any fear of persecution when they leave office, or if they ever leave office. Considering Donald Trump tried everything he could within the bounds that existed at the time to try to, he even stepped over those bounds, I think, into criminal behavior, into staying in office. Now that he doesn't have to worry about prosecution afterwards, he can declare everything an official act. What's to say he's ever going to leave office? And I think these are really strong, powerful considerations that voters are going to have to take into account.
Well, Brad, as you talk about checks and balances, obviously the three branches are supposed to work in a way that they can check each other. Would you say with this decision today that the judicial branch is checking the executive or just empowering it?
Well, you're essentially turning the Supreme Court, the non-unelected bureaucrats, into the arbiters of what's legal and what's not in terms of what a president can or cannot do. They're going to become the arbiters of everything, every little remote. Congress does have a role here in the sense they should have impeached, and they did. They impeached Donald Trump for his actions on Jan 6th. They should have removed him from office, or at the time he was out of office, so they should have prevented him from running for future office as punishment. But Congress has demonstrated that the partisanship is so strong that Republicans can't look past their own partisan politics to prosecute someone who clearly did something criminal on January 6th. We all saw with our own eyes what happened that day. And so I think you're starting to see this erosion of these checks and balances. You're starting to see an empowered Supreme Court with non-elected bureaucrats. AOC this morning, or just moments ago, announced she's going to start filing impeachment charges against Supreme Court justices. So this is going to have a lot of consequences throughout Congress as well.
In the meantime, though, Rick, you're managing a presidential campaign. And if you're Donald Trump's campaign manager or his campaign advisors, you're now looking at a summer that's wide open. It's the 1st of July. I realize there's a sentencing thing going on here between now and the convention. But after that, you know now for a fact that your candidate is not going to be locked in a courtroom. What do you do at the time?
Yeah, from now to probably inaugural, you're not going to be sitting in a courtroom like you did for 5 weeks up in New York during that case, and you're free to schedule. And scheduling is a really critical aspect of this campaign. I mean, putting Donald Trump in the key battleground states to try and take advantage of some of the momentum he's gotten off of the debate last week is now going to be more certain than it's ever been. I mean, this is a campaign that's been rocked by, having to appear in these various court cases during the indictment phase, and frankly, one that took advantage of that. I mean, one of the things we have to remember is Donald Trump has used these court cases to his political advantage. He was down and out in 2021 prior to the first indictment and has ridden these indictments and frankly the convictions to his political advantage. Maybe now it makes it harder for him because he doesn't have that tool to use every week at his disposal. So we'll see what happens next. But look, I mean, I remind everybody, Judge Chutkan's going to have something to say about what she considers in and outside the bounds of immunity. And so I don't think we've heard the last of this. She's going to opine on this as she has in the past. And she was pretty aggressive when it came to what she thought the vulnerabilities of immunity were for Donald Trump. And I don't think the Supreme Court has really taken that club away from her in many ways.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Rick. A lot of these decisions will now be up to her, even if ultimately they do end up back at the Supreme Court at the end of the day. If we continue to consider, though, this idea of scheduling you were speaking to, if you're scheduling for Joe Biden in the aftermath of Thursday's debate, is it now effectively your job to get the president in as many unscripted scenarios as you possibly can, be that sit-down interviews or other appearances in which he needs to ad-lib?
I'd hate to say it, but I think the one thing he needs to schedule is the speech where he withdraws from the campaign and endorses somebody else prior to the Democratic convention. But outside of that, yes, I think that he has a credibility problem that is showing up in the surveys. There's a new CBS survey out that shows almost half his party wanting to withdraw from the campaign. And he has no time to lose. This idea that he took the weekend off and went to Camp David to confer with his family about staying in the race. I mean, frankly, he should have been out trying to do what he did right after the debacle of a debate and do more campaign rallies and frankly do some sit-down interviews, just as you described, Kaylee, about unscripted, non-teleprompter interviews where he actually can show people that he has the capacity to govern.
Brad, I want you to weigh in on this and bring you back to a tweet from Jon Favreau, who is an Obama speechwriter and now pretty well known for his podcast as a Democratic advisor from the Obama campaign. I would simply say calling nearly half your party's voters the bedwetting brigade is not the most effective strategy to assuage their concerns about your candidate and get them to the polls. What is the real conversation that's happening now inside Democratic circles following the freakout on Thursday night?
Well, look, I think there's always been kind of bad blood between some folks in the Obama world, including David Axelrod and Jon Favreau and Joe Biden. The friction was evident all 8 years of when Barack Obama was president. and in the primaries where none of them really thought he would win, and he did. And I think that's part of Joe Biden's strength is that every time he's been counted out and down, he has come back. I think at the rally they played Chumbawamba, I get knocked down, I get back up again, which I thought was kind of a genius theatrical move.
So are they bedwetters?
Well, I mean, look, every day of the week, Democrats are freaking out about something. It's what motivates us. It's what keeps us going. And we should be. It's what makes our candidates stronger. You know, I think, again, my concern is the debate is not going to have that much of an effect on swing voters who are swing voters because they haven't been convinced that he is up to the job just yet. Otherwise, they'd be with Joe Biden squarely and not done. They're not going to Donald Trump because they think he's too mentally unstable. But they've been a little worried of his age, and that worry is continuing. What you're seeing is the base has been confronted with concern over his age for the first time. We've been told he's sharp behind the scenes. We've been told that he can do the job, and from trusted people we trust within the party. And then what was displayed on Thursday night did not reflect what we had been told. And so I think there's a lot of base voters that want to hear an explanation and see more proof that he is the best individual to take on Donald Trump. Because if we fail in this endeavor and Donald Trump returns to the White House, it could very well be the end of democracy.
Brad, we just have 30 seconds left, but how long of a grace period is there for that proof to show up?
Well, I would say a week or two, because then we start heading into convention planning, and the delegate race is going to be pretty insane. I do think the idea of an open convention is not a terrible idea in the sense that you get to see some of the brightest stars in the Democratic Party fight for the votes of the delegates, and then kind of announce with this energy and enthusiasm. But if Joe Biden remains and thinks he's the best one to take on, he's going to have my full support, and I hope the Democratic Party will rally behind him, because the stakes are too high here to head into an election because your feelings were hurt by being called a name from the White House staff.
All right, 2 weeks. We're writing it down. Brad Howard and Rick Davis, thank you for a great conversation and our great panel today here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We'll have a lot more ahead on the fastest show in politics after we update world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. The U.S. Supreme Court ruling Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results. Harold Krent is a professor of law at Chicago-Kent College of Law, and he talked with Bloomberg Intelligence about what this would mean for Trump's upcoming trial.
But that means delay, it means time, and so there will be very likely no kind of trial until after the election.
The justices voting 6-3 ruled for the first time that former presidents are shielded from prosecution for some official acts taken while in office. Record-breaking Hurricane Beryl is intensifying. It is churning through the Caribbean south of Grenada, where it is forecast to unleash catastrophic winds and life-threatening storm surges. Beryl regained Category 4 strength after briefly weakening this morning. The storm rapidly intensified from a tropical depression on Friday to a major Cat 4 hurricane last night. Now, typically, the first hurricane arrives in the Atlantic by August 11th and the first Cat 3 or stronger in September. But meteorologists say the Atlantic is the warmest it has ever been since June. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
Thank you. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomber
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all holding in the green right now. S&P up 10. That is a gain of 0.2%. The Dow up 70, up 0.2%. While NASDAQ is now higher by 107 points, an advance of 0.6%. 10-year yield 4.47%, with a 2-year right now 4.77%. Spot gold up 0.1%, 23.29 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 2.1% right now, 83.28 for a barrel of WTI. Chewy shares are lower now by 4.4%. They did spike earlier in the session after Keith Gill disclosed a 6.6% passive stake in the online pet food and product retailer. Gill, who operates under the moniker of Roaring Kitty, shot to fame in 2021 as he rallied retail traders around video game store GameStop. GameStop shares today down by 5.5%. Again, Chewy shares trading lower by 4.3%. Recapping, S&P up 11 right now. That is a gain of 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington once again. Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York with a look at the first day of trading of this new quarter on this 1st of July. Thank you so much. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons with Joe Matthew in Washington. We're in a typical year. The Supreme Court already would have called it quits for the summer. The term would have ended before today, and we would have all moved on. But of course, it did extend into July, something that happens rarely, as they dropped 3 opinions, one of which is highly consequential for the office of the presidency, let alone this presidential cycle, as the Supreme Court rules on ideological lines 6-3, Joe, that Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution.
Some immunity, which needs to be qualified still, as we now enter what could be a protracted process to figure out what is considered an official act of the president versus unofficial, and where exactly the immunity lies, the presumption of immunity in this case for a sitting president. Sarah Forden runs our legal coverage out of Washington and therefore has been a very busy person through this moment right now. Sarah, it's great to see you. Congrats on the end of the term, although we're left with more questions than some had when we began it.
Lots to parse still here in this decision.
Well, so let's talk about who's going to do the parsing. This basically puts the burden now on Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is the judge overseeing this case against Trump here in Washington, in which he's charged with election subversion. The court did say he has some immunity, but that discretion of what acts actually get to claim that immunity is left to her.
Yeah, so, I mean, the big new takeaway from this decision is that the Supreme Court is saying that a president should have immunity, even for criminal acts, for actions that are taken, in line with his or her official duties. So that is really new law on the question of presidential immunity. But the question now is what constitutes an official act and what constitutes a personal act. And so they've sent the whole case back to Tanya Chutkan to hold, to make findings about, what is, if you talk to your attorney general, they've said that is an official act. So there's no question but that the president has immunity. But other acts, which could include, going to state election officials or working on a slate of state electors, these could come under the personal category, but she's going to have to go through a legal process to make those determinations.
She was already planning for a 2 to 3 month long trial for Jack Smith. How long will this exercise take?
Well, initially she said she would need 2 to 3 months just to prepare for the trial. This exercise really puts a question mark on the timing because she's going to have to, first of all, they have to issue their official mandate. So that could take several weeks. We don't know. There was no mention in the opinion that needs to be expedited. So that could take more time just to send it back to Chutkan. And then Chutkan will have to take it up and then set a briefing schedule. And so this whole thing can just stretch out indefinitely. Also, because even if she does make certain findings, there's still the possibility of appeals, which could send the whole case back to the Supreme Court. So honestly, there's no end in sight at this moment. for this trial.
So is there any recourse at all for special counsel Jack Smith? Could he potentially redraft the indictment to remove anything that could possibly fall under the category of official acts, or are his hands effectively tied until all of this can be played out?
I mean, it seems his hands are pretty tied in this case. I mean, he could definitely come back with some motions and some filings, but right now the next steps and the onus is on Chutkan to make these determinations. So it's really in her hands.
We can assume, though, that this is going to come back before this very same court, right?
Absolutely.
So a lot of folks wonder why the waste of time, months in the making to bring us to this point, knowing it would simply come back to the high court. There's no real answer for that, is there?
I mean, this opinion was authored by the Chief Justice, John Roberts. So clearly he has feelings that these are important questions that need to be decided kind of for eternity. And one of the things that we're noting in some follow-up pieces is that, you know, the elephant in the room here is the November election.
Right.
There was no mention of the election or the political process in this opinion.
But he did make mention of this whole idea of timing. In his majority opinion, he said, despite the unprecedented nature of this case, the significant constitutional questions that it raises, its expedited treatment in the lower courts, and in this court, the lack of factual analysis in the lower courts. He's essentially arguing that this court, the high court, is taking its time in a way that is appropriate, which the lower courts did not do.
Exactly. So it's almost as though they want to make this for, you know, eternity, but, you know, the facts are taking off, you know, as we speak. And so there's going to be the interplay between their decision and then what happens in the political realm.
Yeah.
Sarah, great to have you with us. Sarah Forden, Bloomberg News, Washington, D.C. legal team leader. I hope that means you get to go to Disney World or something. That's the term. It's like, God, she's been super busy, Kaylee, for a long time. Knowing that they were going to save the big stuff for last, but it sure seems like they could have done this in June. Is it just me?
Well, that's the question. They heard these arguments in April, and
Yes.
we've come back to cases the court has decided in the past related to presidential elections, be it Bush v. Gore. It took them a matter of days. It was brought up to my attention by former Watergate prosecutor Nick Ackerman earlier that in the Watergate tapes case, it took them a matter of weeks. They do have the power to decide quickly when they decide the situation merits.
It's worth reminding people of that. As we had the voice of Jane Hall at American University, where she's professor of journalism and media studies here, author of Politics in the Media, Intersections and New Directions. Jane, looking forward to talking with you about the debate last week and the aftermath more specifically, but with regard to today's Supreme Court ruling, when you back off and look at this from your perch at American University, is the presidency being redefined?
You know, I think that it probably is, and I appreciate the fact that you all led with the facts of the case and the impact potentially on democracy, and now it's going to be analyzed and used by each side in the debate, in the politics. We are seeing in real time a decision comes down and cable news has people coming on immediately analyzing it, legal experts and then political experts, and all together analyzing how this will be portrayed. Will it be helpful to Donald Trump? Will it be helpful to Joe Biden? So, you know, this is sort of a follow-on what you saw with the disastrous performance and the visuals of Joe Biden and how that has played out. And you can see it in the people who came out and who were put out, frankly, to speak on Sunday shows and are talking now about don't abandon Biden, as well as the people who immediately said, I'm close to Joe Biden coming out of the debate on CNN and on MSNBC. I'm close to him. He should resign.
Well, let's talk about one of those voices on the Sunday shows. We did hear on NBC's Meet the Press yesterday from the senator from Georgia, Raphael Warnock, who was essentially acknowledging Biden's poor debate performance, but still had this to say.
There have been more than a few Sundays when I wish I had preached a better sermon. But after the sermon was over, it was my job to embody the message, to show up for the people that I serve. And that's what Joe Biden has been doing his entire life of public service. And over the last 4 years, Joe Biden has demonstrated not over 90 minutes, but over the last 4 years, the character and the mettle of the man that he is.
So, Jane, I guess my question to you is what is 4 years when a short span of time that captured the attention of tens of millions and hundreds of millions more when you look at what was cut up and consumed in the aftermath on social media? What becomes more important in making a decision as to how you're going to vote?
Well, I think that is the key question. And from what I understand and what I know about the media, there is an attempt by Biden supporters to say, including Ralph Warnock and others, that this was 90 minutes, that he has a 3.5-year-long presidency and a decades-long history. People are acknowledging that he did not make the case that they expected him to make, and you see that being played out. And I guess what I'm seeing and thinking about is they're probably going to wait for the polls and see what is the polling on this. What does the so-called average voter think? Is the damage from seeing these bites replayed in the split screen that many people were shocked by? I think even Biden's supporters. Is that the measure of the man, or can they reframe it? What should they be doing to put him out there? And how loud will the voices be if his poll numbers drop significantly and people are concerned about whether they can win in Congress?
Well, we did get a quick turn poll from CBS News and YouGov. You might have seen, Jane, when asked whether the president was, quote, or had, quote, the mental and cognitive health to serve as president, unquote. Only 27% of respondents said yes, 72% said no. So how should the media be covering this right now? Because there are two conversations going on. There's the one we just heard from Raphael Warnock, and I can add a whole bunch to that list. Chris Coons has been working overtime, and a lot of other very loyal Democrats. Even Wes Moore was out yesterday morning making the case for Joe Biden. You can see the public tweets, at least, from Barack Obama and others. But there's another conversation apparently happening behind closed doors, and that's what to do if this is not going to be Joe Biden's convention in Chicago. How do we handle it? To what extent is that the responsible story to be covering here, knowing that that's the less likely outcome?
I think the media are going to have to cover all of them. This is an extraordinary news period. I mean, it is in some ways heartening to me to see the news coverage and see the analysis that we're seeing largely. I think that a good job is being done by what I would call the establishment, legacy media, mainstream media. I think that in large part, just like the Supreme Court decision is consequential historically, and how will it play out? We will have to cover, I still count myself as a reporter and as a journalist in many ways. The news media will have to cover the scenario of, could this actually happen? I think, to your question, it would be a disservice to say this can't happen. You need to point out, this could happen, here's how it could, here are the difficulties, here's the conversation going on behind the scenes, here's the conversation that's going where they are huddled, and, much is being made of Jill Biden's role in this, and what she said afterwards. You have to cover all of this as responsibly and as fully as you can. And I think that's all that the news media can do at this point.
Well, as we consider what the news media does in the aftermath, there also are still remaining questions, Jane, about the way that some members of the media, specifically at CNN, handled the actual event itself, in that the moderators did not fact-check Donald Trump in real time, left that entirely to the president, and we know that he struggled to a large extent with that. Is that responsible in 2024 when we know that Donald Trump lied outright on some 30 occasions?
Well, that is a complicated question. My understanding and my perception of that was that when I watched it, I said, I think that it may not be possible to completely fact-check Donald Trump in real time. He has confounded every format that has ever been put forward. CNN and the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign set those rules. They have said that it was not their job to fact check. Now, you can be critical of that and say there were some things that were so egregious, should they have stepped in? Some of the things that he said about being able to deliver a baby and then murdering the baby. You did see Dana Bash ask Donald Trump several times questions about would he honor the results of the election. You know, I think that unfortunately Biden did not make the case, and yet this campaign sought this debate, and people thought, now we look at it erroneously, that it would be helpful not to have Donald Trump able to be unleashed and spew lies. I have to say, I said before this that I thought it might actually help him. He could look more presidential. He could hold himself in check, and Biden was not able to goad him.
Jane, it's great to have you back. Thanks for the insights, as always. Jane Hall at American University. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons on the fastest show in politics. Kaylee will meet back here 5 o'clock, Washington time, for the late edition of Balance of Power, only here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everyone. Live on Bloomberg TV Radio, streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Tim Stanovic. My co-host, Carol Massar, is off on assignment. Bloomberg TV anchor Katie Greifeld in for Carol this afternoon. Katie, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here. Hey, here's the setup this hour on this Monday, July 1st, the first trading day of the third quarter and of a holiday-shortened trading week. What are stocks doing, Katie?
They're mixed right now, of course. You take a look at the bond market. That's mixed as well. A little bit of a sell-off underway. This all is traders really weighing the potential economic implications of the November U.S. presidential election.
Okay, implications is what we're talking about, especially when it comes to the Supreme Court decision that everybody was waiting for. The court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity. We've got the details and the implications ahead.
Also, Wall Street pros feeling uneasy about retail investors again. Some are concerned there could be trouble after dark. We'll discuss.
And Boeing and Spirit making it official. After a 2-decade split, they are finally back together again.
And our one more thing, the $1.3 billion company that Taylor Swift steps all over.
First up, though, we're checking the day's trade and top business stories because we got all that coming up. But first, Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Tim and Katie. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing right now, a 0.1% gain for both the S&P and the Dow. NASDAQ pushing higher by 95 points, up 0.5%. 10-year yield, 4.48%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.78%. Spot gold up 0.1%. Little change there, $23.29 the ounce. While West Texas Intermediate crude is up 2.3%, 83.40 for WTI. Bitcoin up 2.7%, 63,590 right now on Bitcoin. Nvidia shares lower by 0.2%. French antitrust regulators are preparing to charge Nvidia over alleged anti-competitive practices. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Again, recapping, S&P up by 0.1%, higher now by 7 points. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. Well, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court case pretty much everyone has been waiting for. The court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results, all but ensuring that a trial will not happen before the November election. The justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines, and this federal appeals court was too categorical in rejecting Trump's immunity arguments, the judges said, ruling for the first time that former presidents are shielded from prosecution for some official acts taken while in office. So let's get to the interview. We got with us Greg Storr, Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Greg, the court stopped short of tossing out the indictment like Trump wanted, but the former president said on Truth Social that it was a, quote, big win for our Constitution and democracy. How big of a win is this for the former president?
It is a huge win for him. First of all, from a political standpoint, he got the most important thing with regard to this upcoming election, which is there will almost certainly not be a trial before the election. That was something that Special Counsel Jack Smith was pushing for. He wasn't saying that explicitly, but he was pushing to have a quick trial. That's not going to happen. And then more broadly, the court, took a lot of things out of this indictment that said that, like his conversations with the acting attorney general, that can't be part of this indictment. And it raised questions about a lot of other things, including his conversations with Mike Pence, his public remarks on the ellipse right before the Capitol riot. The court raised questions about whether a prosecution could be based on those. So this indictment, even if it does go forward at some point to trial, may end up looking very, very different.
Well, let's talk also, too, about the fact that they did send this back to U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is, of course, overseeing the case, basically giving it to her to decide what is off limits to the prosecution. What does that decision tree look like?
Yeah, so certain things are definitely off limits. As I mentioned, his communications with the Justice Department, the Supreme Court said that's an official act. He can't be prosecuted for that. The other areas that are in the indictment, Judge Chutkan's going to have to probably hold a hearing on each of those things. They may be separate hearings because the evidence about Donald Trump's conversations with state officials, for example, may be very different from his evidence about the the tweets he put out or that speech he gave. And all those things need to be resolved before this case goes to trial. Probably what's going to happen is she'll make some rulings, and those rulings may go back up on appeal, all this before trial takes place.
Greg, what is the litmus test for official and unofficial conduct of a president?
Yeah, so the court, for the first time, provided some guidelines for what it thinks is the dividing line there. Now, keep in mind, up until today, there hasn't been such a thing as criminal immunity for presidents for official acts. But basically what it said was if the president is doing things that the Constitution explicitly says is exclusively the president's authority, that is totally off limits. And then for other things that we know the president does in the general course of doing the job, including things like speaking to members of Congress, speaking to the public, then what the court said was we need a really explicit a line from Congress, an explicit determination from Congress that we want the president covered under this provision. And then finally it said for things that are truly private, the president cannot or can be prosecuted for those. It sort of suggested the kind of the trappings of what went into the context of what went into a particular action may determine whether it was public or private.
And I want to talk about the fact that we are having this conversation in July. Of course, the term was extended slightly, and we had to wait until July 1st to actually get this decision. And the Supreme Court, it has faced some accusations of slow walking this matter, Greg.
Yeah, the court, if it had wanted to, could have resolved this much more quickly. Jack Smith, back in December of last year, asked the court to take the case up on an expedited basis. The court turned him down at that point, decided to take it up later on. There are certainly ways the court could have resolved this case so that there would be more of a question about whether a trial could actually happen this year. Instead, they scheduled arguments for the very last argument day of their term, and waited until the very last decision day of the term to resolve it. Now, there are a lot of really big constitutional questions in there. The majority justices undoubtedly felt like these are really, really important and we want to take our time. But the upshot of it is that it certainly has given Donald Trump a huge tactical victory.
Okay, so speaking of that victory, what happens if the former president is elected in November to this case?
Yeah, so the bottom line there will almost certainly be he can make this case go away. The exact mechanism may be a little bit complicated in terms of, his instructions to the Justice Department, et cetera, and depends maybe on exactly where this case is in the pipeline. But he will be able to make it go away because he does have the authority as the head of the executive branch to tell the Justice Department what to do. Now, that may be, people I'm sure will say, that is a huge violation of the norms that have governed the Justice Department throughout our history. But as a practical matter, there's little question that Donald Trump will be able to do that.
Greg Storr, certainly appreciate it. Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Storr joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Continuing our coverage, we bring in Professor Carolyn Shapiro, founder and co-director of the Chicago-Kent College of Law's Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States. She joins us from Evanston, Illinois. Also with us here in our Bloomberg studio, David Weston, a lawyer and host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Fridays on Bloomberg TV and radio. After law school, David clerked for J. Edward Lombard and the Second Circuit, and for Lewis F. Powell on the Supreme Court. Professor Shapiro, I do want to start with you, just broadly speaking, a question here about the power of the presidency. How does this Supreme Court decision today change the office of the presidency?
It changes the ability of the president to abuse the office in remarkable ways. Not only does the president have really remarkably broad immunity, although the contours are left very vague in this opinion. Remember that the president also has the pardon power. So a president could come into office, could decide to use his office to do things like assassinate his political rivals, order people in the government to do that, and promise them and then give them pardons for doing so. So I think it sets up the potential for a kind of dictatorship that we've never faced before. It's frankly quite terrifying.
And David, come on in here. I mean, when you think about this and the fact that, again, I keep coming back to the fact that we're talking about this in July. You think about the timeline here. And I mean, it just seems when you layer this on with the Supreme Court decisions that we got last week, and of course, with the debate, I mean, this just seems like the last week or so has really gone in Donald Trump's favor. And now there's this, which he is touting on social media as a big win.
Yeah, well, of course, I agree with Greg Storer. The timing is everything here. And given the decision of the Supreme Court and how many things would have to be really decided by the district court, it's unlikely, I think, that they're actually going to get to a trial anytime before November. Having said that, let's go back a bit. This is a case of first impression. It's not as if the Supreme Court had decided a different way in the past, and so presidents all thought, oh, by the way, we have immunity or we don't have immunity, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. This is a different case. It's new. It was a split decision. It was not just down one way. It wasn't evenly split, but one side wanted absolute immunity across the board. The other side wanted no immunity at all. It was somewhere in between, and the court sent it back down to have some things reconciled. I'm not sure it leads to an automatic dictatorship or possibly a dictatorship, because I say I'm not sure presidents in the past have said, oh, by the way, I have total immunity so I can do everything I want, or on the other side said, I better not do that because I might get prosecuted for it. I'm not sure that's the way it's worked.
So, David, what would you say characterizes this decision in terms of the office of the president? How does it change the office of the presidency in your view?
Well, it certainly says if it's an unofficial act, all bets are off. We can prosecute you, whatever happens. It also says there are certain core values, powers of the president that are absolutely immune, without doubt. And then there's a middle course, which, by the way, as we know, has been the case for some time. There are some areas where Congress and the president have jurisdiction to do things. In those areas, and this is where I think it is important, it did go Donald Trump's way. They didn't say it's a balancing between whether it interferes with what the president does and other values. It just said if it interferes with what the president wants to do, then he gets immunity. I do agree that really does put a thumb on the scale in favor of the president.
And Carolyn, let's talk about what is immediately next. Of course, this is being sent back to the U.S. District Judge, basically to decide what is off limits, what is on limits, what basically counts as official and non-official. I mean, how straightforward is that process? How much time should that actually take?
I don't think we have any idea how much time it will take, and it's not going to be straightforward, in large part because the majority gave very little guidance about how to reach those determinations. It does mean, though, that even though there will not be an actual trial before the election, that there may be an opportunity for Jack Smith to publicly lay out the allegations and evidence of the former president's acts in a way that is that would be similar to what might happen at a trial. And that's, I think, an important, and although small, silver lining to the court, to the Supreme Court sending it back to the district court.
Professor Shapiro, in the opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that, quote, "The president is not above the law." Does this ruling, though, effectively mean that the president is above the law?
It means the president is above the law often. And certainly any time the president is engaging in official acts, is probably above the law. The definition of the core functions that lead to absolute immunity is, again, it's not clear, but it actually is pretty broad. Includes things like the removal power of which is not explicit in the Constitution at all. The removal power of members of the executive branch, for example. They even mentioned the take care clause, which is ironic given that at the same time that they say the president's take care that the law be faithfully executed duties might be part of his core constitutional duties. They're giving him the authority and the ability to simply not follow the law. It's going to take a long time to really know, at least one more round of appeals to really know how this is going to apply in this case. And I'll just add, I find this opinion shocking and in many ways. And one thing that really astonishes me, frankly, is the court's inability to say, or unwillingness to say, that things that happened on January 6th itself were not official acts. The president made a speech to his followers. The then president made a speech to his followers on the ellipse. He sent out tweets encouraging people to come to Washington. In order to falsely and corruptly hold onto power. It's implausible to me that that can be part of his official acts, and yet the court could not bring itself even to say that.
David, what were your thoughts around that? Because that was a question I didn't have a chance to ask Greg about, which is what happened on January 6th, or how the president acted on January 6th, was not in an official capacity. How did you read that in the opinion?
Whether rightly or wrongly, I think what the Supreme Court said was that's up to the district court to determine. What he said in the opinion, the Chief Justice, was, look, at sometimes when the president speaks to the public, that is an official act. He's not saying every time it is, but sometimes it is. This may have been with that scope, and it's up to the district court to determine. So it's not as if they said it is official automatically what happened. He's exempt on January 6th, but they did leave open the possibility it might be determined to be that.
And Carolyn, I'm also
compare that to
please.
what they said about his conversations with the Justice Department. What they say about his conversations with the Justice Department is that those conversations are in his core constitutional duties, and therefore he's absolutely immune. So they didn't send that back. It's true. They didn't say he's got immunity in particular for any particular act that happened on January 6th, but they couldn't bring themselves to say he doesn't.
Well, but I'm sorry, just to interrupt for a second, at least my understanding of it, you would understand it better than I do, Professor. Basically, they said, look, if Congress doesn't have the authority to limit or curtail the president's authority in some different direction, then you cannot prosecute him for it, almost by definition, because you're prosecuting him under a congressional statute. And it does seem plausible to me that Congress could not legislatively tell the president whether he can dismiss or not dismiss executive branch members, right?
Well, under current law, there are some executive branch members that he has the constitutional, that Congress can't say he can't dismiss. That's true. But the absolute immunity here goes beyond that. The absolute immunity here goes to conversations in furtherance, allegedly, but of this attempt to overthrow the election. And not only did the court say he has absolute immunity for those conversations, it said that his motives don't matter in determining when there's immunity, and the government can't even rely on the acts for which he has immunity as evidence in support of the acts that they can charge him with. So the government can't tell the jury about what happened when he talked to the Justice Department as part of establishing the course of conduct that culminated in, and the motivations that culminated in whatever it is that they are allowed to charge him with.
We only have about 30 seconds left, David, and I just want to end with you because you did spend time on the Supreme Court when you clerked for Lewis F. Powell. We got 30
in ancient
seconds
days,
left.
we call it.
Well,
Yeah.
but you have experience about how decisions like this are brought together and how they come together. Just 30 seconds on that.
Well, back in those days, I mean, people took it very seriously and went back and forth, and they debated and they discussed. I mean, I must say, I was there just a few years after the U.S. against Nixon, which was all the Republican-nominated justices did vote against Richard Nixon, which is a very different case. But it was different. I'm not sure that this Supreme Court is exactly like the one that I worked under, because there has been a lot more politics injected in it, and I think they've reached out for some cases. That's me editorializing. I think they've reached out for some controversial cases they didn't need to.
I think there would be a lot of people who might agree with that sentiment. A big thank you to Professor Carolyn Shapiro, founder and co-director of the Chicago-Kent College of Law's Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States, and also David Weston here at Bloomberg News. He's host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Fridays on Bloomberg TV and radio. And yes, also a lawyer. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all pushing higher right now. S&P gaining 14 points, very close to the best level of the day right now at 54.74, a gain of 0.2%. The Dow up 57, up 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 137, now up by about 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.48% with a 2-year 4.78%. Gold up $1 the ounce to $23.27. Little change there. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 2.3%, $83.40 for a barrel of WTI. Boeing has agreed to buy back Spirit AeroSystems Holdings for $37.25 a share. It is an all-stock deal that values the supplier at $4.7 billion, unwinding a 2-decade separation as the embattled playmaker tries to fix its manufacturing defects. We'll have more coming up this hour with George Ferguson of Bloomberg Intelligence. Again, recapping S&P up 14, up 0.3. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thanks so much for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. Well, as I mentioned, it's today's Big Take. It's one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal. It's about how 24-hour stock trading is booming, and it's got Wall Street rattled. Lou Wang and Catherine Doherty write about the momentum building in the overnight market and how it's got some concern there could be some trouble after dark. Kat Doherty is Bloomberg News finance reporter. She joins us here in the Bloomberg studio. So, Kat, the cash market for U.S. equities goes from 9:30 to 4. Maybe you can leave work after 4 because the market's closed. There are some, though, there is some trading after hours, like, you know, earnings happens, we watch what happens. The volume is a little thin. What exactly is Robinhood doing?
So there's the pre-market and post-market hours, which you can put in trades, and I kind of consider that still traditional investing that bleeds into the 9:30 to 4 p.m. parameters that are set. But then you have this gap overnight that's from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. And Robinhood, Interactive Brokers, they are offering the ability for their clients to trade U.S. stocks in those hours. So it's really bridging the gap, and where they are seeing the most demand is mostly from users that are overseas. So think about Asia and Europe, people that are waking up earlier or going to bed and just trading in their own normal hours. So that's really where we're seeing the momentum growing.
Do you know that I have a podcast?
I have heard of your podcast. Yes,
Okay,
I
so
did know that.
I have a podcast with Matt Levine. It's called Money Stuff. And we talked about this. The fact that you could see 24/7, 24/5 trading has also been a topic of conversation. But you think about how the market works right now, where trading is concentrated. It's the open and the close. Even though it's open for several hours throughout the day, you really have that concentration at the open and the close. And I mean, if we entered into this situation where the market never shut, I think I called it like goblin hours, where you'd have just this funky overnight trading, and where would the liquidity go? I mean, would you still see those concentrations of liquidity, or what would that even look like?
So this is exactly the type of questions that the New York Stock Exchange and other exchange operators are asking their own clients, because they're not going to build an offering if there isn't demand for it. And Katie, you bring up liquidity. If there is many shoppers, I like to kind of use that anecdote, that are all concentrated in a certain parameter, you're going to get better price improvement. You're going to get a better quality of your shopping experience. So that's why you're seeing kind of a rush at either the open or the close for certain stocks. And so if you spread that out, it could impact, just because of the spread of liquidity and who's shopping when, it could impact pricing. So that is why right now, when you look at 24/5 trading in some of these apps, it's mostly retail investors. It's not as if you're seeing a hedge fund making big bets overnight, because quite frankly, they're not going to get the best pricing for that.
But could we see that? Could we see the situation where you do have these goblin hours of trading, where it's a bunch of retail traders trading off hours, but then you have hedge funds and other types of professional players coming in and basically trying to make a buck?
I think that the answer to that question lies in the resources that firms put into, for example, maybe expanding their people and their presence overseas. If you need someone to be up, right? And it doesn't really make sense to employ traders and have them make trades at 4 in the morning if they're based in the US. However, if you open up an office in Asia or in Europe, you might be able to make those trades and provide those services. And same thing for the banks. Like you need to actually invest to expand and build out the infrastructure to support the growth of this market. And we're seeing that. We're seeing firms that are, this is new for Robinhood, for example, to offer 24/5 trading, and they had to invest in it and make sure that they have a partner, Blue Ocean, that is the ATS, the alternative trading system that they're sending the orders to. So this is all things they have to build out the infrastructure, and they wouldn't do that if they didn't have clients that were asking for it.
When the clients who are asking for it, these are, what do we know about these clients?
So a lot of them are retail investors, and I believe that the stocks that they are trading, there's similarities
they call them
to
stonks.
meme stocks. So you see all of the headlines that you're reading about AMC and GameStop. Those are the types of shares that are going to be trading overnight as well. There's a lot of crossover.
I wonder what it means for like the CFO of a publicly traded company, you know, who can say, okay, well, it's 4 o'clock on a Friday. I can go home and not worry about the company's stock price until Monday morning, maybe 4 a.m., but most likely 9:30.
So there are parameters that are set in these overnight trading where there's, it depends on the platform, but I believe for Robinhood it's 20% that the shares cannot rise 20% more than the current or below. It's just to have some safety nets. And some are even tighter, like 5%. So you're going to prevent wild price swings overnight. And the pricing is not going to be as immediate in terms of, or compared to what you would see in the normal day hours.
I have to say, I find this conversation a bit depressing.
Why?
Like, I just
because
feel
you like it when the market's closed. And
I do. I like having a weekend, and it feels like just the evolution of everything, but including markets, is increasingly we're always on, and I feel like in some ways, you know, we've seen financial markets take a page out of, dare I say it, the crypto markets.
Yeah, that's what I always think of when I talk 24-hour trading, because it's like,
and think about currencies.
Bitcoin never stops trading.
Currencies also trade FX. Like there's other markets that do operate in this way, and it doesn't mean, Katie, that you're having to stay in the studio overnight or come in on the weekend. So I really do think that this is just firms are going to adapt, including news firms. But it is true that you walk out on the streets and you might get a news alert on your phone or on your watch, and you're going to react to that. And investors, they might be able to like express their own investment decision in a tighter or different time frame than what was previously available.
And this is sort of a philosophical, hypothetical sort of situation, but you think about how companies and how the government releases news right now. They do it outside of market hours for a reason, so that markets don't go crazy. You think about the 8:30 a.m. Data releases. You think about when companies come out with earnings or big material changes.
Or really bad news.
Exactly. You know, if markets are
8
always
p.m. on a Friday.
Putting it out, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 p.m. on a Friday, maybe it changes corporate behavior as well. Of course, those are sort of unanswerable questions right now.
Right. And again, you can't, the wild swings that you might see in normal day hours, you would not see that overnight because there are parameters in place to prevent that from happening.
In reporting out this story, did you speak to anyone who laid out worst case scenario for you that actually you thought to yourself, okay, this could be not so good for financial markets?
I think the worst case scenario is that, again, it's all about investments to expand the infrastructure of the market, and the firms that are going to lose out are the ones that don't have the same resources as the bigger firms that can adapt. So you might see a bifurcation. You might see the biggest banks and the biggest market makers get even bigger and stronger because they have the resources to capture this momentum, whereas the smaller players that just can't compete because they don't have the same amount of resources, that might become harder and harder. And so what does that do to competition? To be determined.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very preliminary conversation, even though it feels like we've been talking about it for a while. And to the point that, you would think some of the professionals would want this, the exchanges, the market makers, if there's more trading, they would theoretically make more money. Is anyone campaigning against this, so to speak? Is there anyone who vocally does not want this to happen? Besides me.
So there is an application with the SEC. 24 Exchange is trying to be a registered stock exchange, and it would be the first to offer 24/7 or 24/5, whatever it ends up being. But it would be the first regulated venue. So Gary Gensler has said that the SEC is reviewing this application. He's said he's not against it because he's actually for anything that is pro-innovation, pro-competition in the marketplace, which this is. It's a new venue, but they need to answer a lot of questions. SIFMA put out their own comment letter basically saying, hey, SEC, you really need to answer all of these different parameters and think through the implications that this, if you approved it, this new venue would have on the marketplace as a whole. And so I think that it's still going to be a long haul, and the questions, and there are many, need to be answered for that application to go through and for this to continue to grow. If we see a registered exchange, that might mean that the biggest stock exchanges like NASDAQ and NYSE have to follow and offer 24/7 or 24/5 trading. So all of these things are going to play out in the next months, years to come, and we'll see if it affects our jobs.
I was going to say, Katie, you got to file something to the SEC that says you're concerned for financial journalists.
I'll submit a comment letter or something. Yeah.
Hey, again, it's among the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal today. It's today's big take. Kat Doherty is Bloomberg News finance reporter. Check out her story and more on the Bloomberg terminal. Well, let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The Supreme Court has extended the delay in the Washington criminal case against Donald Trump on charges he plotted to overturn his 2020 presidential election loss, all but ending prospects that he could be tried before the November election. In a historic ruling, the justices said for the first time, former presidents can be shielded from prosecution for at least some of what they do in the Oval Office. The justices have ordered lower courts now to figure out how to apply the decision to Trump's case, rather than do it themselves. Howard Krent is a professor of law at Chicago-Kent College of Law. He talked with Bloomberg Intelligence about guidance for what the lower courts are supposed to do next.
The court's opinion is more detailed than we expected, and so the district court will have to thumb through and sort of get clues and hints. And the court did give a couple of examples in the opinion about what it considered to be worthy of absolute immunity and what it didn't.
Professor Howard Krent at Chicago-Kent College of Law on Bloomberg Intelligence. Forecasters are watching Hurricane Beryl in the Caribbean. It is the earliest Category 4 hurricane on record. It formed farther east than any other Atlantic hurricane in June. Beryl grew to a Cat 4 on Sunday morning, and it is expected to cross the Yucatan Peninsula by the end of this week. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. Yes, NASDAQ 100 index all advancing. Russell 2000, though, in the red, down 0.8%. Here's where we stand. S&P up 8 now, 54.69, up 0.2%. The Dow up 27, up by about 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 113, up 0.6%. The world's biggest bond market getting hit as traders weigh some of the potential implications of the November election after last week's presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. 10-year 4.47%, but the 2-year right now 4.77%. Spot gold little changed, up just under 0.1%, 23.28 an ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.3%, 83.39 for a barrel of WTI. The popular stocks influencer Keith Gill, better known as Roaring Kitty, is being sued for allegedly orchestrating a so-called pump and dump scheme involving GameStop shares. Gill, you recall, rose to fame promoting GameStop during the 2021 meme stock craze. He reemerged in May and again began posting about the games retailer on X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. GameStop today down by 4.5%. Again, recapping, S&P up 9, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie. Certainly do appreciate it. I do want to stick with Boeing because a lot happening with Boeing. Shares higher by about 2.3%. 6 months after a fuselage blowout threw Boeing into crisis, the full weight of the legal and financial fallout from the near catastrophic accident is bearing down on the company. The Justice Department plans to charge Boeing with criminal fraud after finding that the company violated a 2021 deferred prosecution agreement tied to previous fatal crashes. That's what Bloomberg News reported late Sunday. And then just hours later, Boeing announced a plan to buy back Spirit AeroSystems. Remember, this was a supplier that had spun off 2 decades ago. It's going to buy that for $4.7 billion. This a bid to improve manufacturing. We got with us George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst. He joins us from Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters in New Jersey. George, I want to start with the U.S. Justice Department news that we got late yesterday. The plane maker is supposed to choose between pleading guilty or taking the risk of actually going to trial. This, according to people familiar with the matter cited in the Bloomberg News story yesterday. What are the implications for Boeing here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if they decide they want to go to trial and fight this, I think the company does run the risk of being declared a felon. I guess I'm not a legal expert, so I understand companies can be convicted of felonies, I guess, and then that could make it difficult for them to get government contracts. And then you do run.
So that's what I wanted to talk about here, because the government is a big customer of Boeing, and we talked a lot about this in the past with you. What's the complication here of the customer going after the company that they purchased from, and sort of I know you're not a lawyer or a legal expert here, but this gets really messy really quickly.
Yeah, and so I'll say again, I'm not a legal analyst, but from my financial industry analyst hat, having that on, I would say it gets even more complicated than you might expect, because there are products they build for the U.S. government that I don't think anyone else could step into short term and supply. And I'll give you one, like the KC-46 tanker. They've had a lot of problems with it, a lot of cost overruns on it, but they supply that tanker to the U.S. military because the existing tanker fleet is 50 plus years old, and we need to rejuvenate that fleet. If the government decided they wouldn't buy any more from Boeing, Airbus could step in and provide a tanker, but it would take years and years, and then you run this sort of second sort of tier effect of, are you putting the company out of business? I mean, this is one of your most important defense contractors. So I think they reserve the right not to be able to give them any defense contracts, but I practically have a hard time seeing that happening.
And is that really the reason why the stock is up over 2% today? It's interesting, again, the contrast between the headline, which sounds very bad, then you take a look at what the stock is actually doing. And this is a great day for the stock, and it hasn't had a lot of great days recently. And I mean, it just feels like at the end of the day, I mean, Boeing is an incumbent by a long shot here, a large margin.
It is, right? And look, it's not like there's no other defense contractors. There are, and there are other commercial aircraft manufacturers. But I would say, the reason Boeing, I think shareholders are excited today is because it looks like some of the challenges to getting to a better place are starting to get fixed. And I would say, first of all, I don't think we've heard from Boeing on whether or not they're willing to accept this offer from DOJ. But generally, the offer that I saw, which included, someone that's going to come in and provide some more oversight, and included a fine, which I think brings the fine total to $500 million, and then would keep them out of a situation where they would have this felony against the company. That whole, again, not being a legal analyst, but that whole package appeared to be something that would be very manageable for Boeing to go ahead and accept. Now, I don't know all the interior details of that. So that doesn't look bad. It looks maybe better than we might have expected. And then at the same time, they announced that purchase of Spirit AeroSystems last night. It looks like Airbus would cart away the stuff that they need to make their airplanes and get paid some $500 million. We knew that was a loss-making business, but that clears up the major hurdle for Boeing to bring in Spirit, and bringing Spirit into the fold, I think, is the path to higher build rates and higher quality on the money-making 737. And Boeing really needs a really good second half to this year. They burned $4 billion of cash in the first quarter. They told us to expect similar numbers in the second quarter, and we've seen deliveries lower than they were in first quarter. So we could even see a worse cash burn in 2Q. They need to turn that around. We don't think they're going to get positive for the year, but they need to turn that around because they can't keep burning $4 billion a quarter and not run out of money sooner or later.
Hey, George.
So it seems like they're starting to set things up.
George, with the Spirit deal, and especially that part going to Airbus, does that mean that Spirit will no longer have to sell, or Boeing will no longer sell to Airbus as a result of the way this transaction's working? Does Boeing not become a supplier for Airbus because Spirit was?
Exactly. This would peel away the Airbus pieces so that Boeing isn't responsible to deliver anything to Airbus so they can make aircraft.
Okay. So are there any other parts of Boeing's supply chain that you see moving forward that could get folded into Boeing?
Look, I think there's always a potential, and so prior to the buy of Spirit, we saw Spirit buying in pieces of the supply chain. So obviously going forward, if you had these problems in the supply chain, and a lot of this is strategic buys where the supplier is breaking down financially, can't meet its commitments for quality or something, and they're going ahead and being absorbed into the company. So I think going forward, that means Boeing could do some smaller absorptions like that, purchases like that. I don't see any large size purchases by Boeing, anything this size, they'd have to pull in to fix supply chain.
And I want to talk a little bit about what this Spirit AeroSystem being bought by Boeing, what this means for the fundamentals of both companies, because we did get a headline from Moody's, for example, saying that ratings of Spirit AeroSystems on review for an upgrade. You take a look at the fact that this is all stock, and you have some people out on the street saying that this could help Boeing really hold off from a downgrade. And you think about the state of Boeing's financials right now, how important, George, just in about a minute, is that investment grade rating to Boeing?
Well, I think it's critical in case they have to get back into the bond markets and raise more money, and there's probably a decent probability that they might need to do that. And so I think Spirit not going to bring anything to the profit line for at least the first year or so. I mean, sort of this deal's not going to get consummated until 2025, so maybe they could bring a little bit, but not a big contribution to profit from Spirit. A little bit of contribution to revenue. I think the rating agency is still sort of looking through near-term challenges to better days.
Hey, George, we just have 10 seconds left, but what's one more thing that you're watching between now and the end of the year for Boeing's health?
Labor. Boeing's biggest labor union's coming to the table in September. They're getting a strike vote authorization is kind of near as I can read what that is in July. That's going to be a rough discussion.
Okay, we'll certainly have you back on before now and then to chat about that and everything at Boeing. That's George Ferguson from Bloomberg Intelligence. He's Senior Aerospace Defense and Airlines Analyst joining us from New Jersey. Coming up next, they make the stages for Taylor Swift, and they could be valued at more than $1 billion. It's One More Thing. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. It is 2:53 on Wall Street. Coinbase Global says the U.S. Marshal Service has selected it to provide custody and advanced trading services for seized digital assets held by the agency. The agency is responsible for asset forfeitures and has handled billions in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin over the years. Coinbase now higher by 5.6%. NVIDIA shares are back in the green, up 0.4%. French antitrust regulators are preparing to charge NVIDIA over alleged anti-competitive practices. This according to Reuters, citing sources. Tesla is expected to report another quarter of weaker sales tomorrow, and it's running out of alibis. Analysts are estimating the carmaker will report that it handed over 441,000 EVs in the second quarter. That is a 5.4%. And it would be the second consecutive quarterly decline. Tesla shares right now, they're up 6.9%. Sources tell Bloomberg Teva Pharmaceutical Industries is being investigated by the FTC over patents for certain drugs, including asthma inhalers. A source says the agency is seeking information about contested patents that may have been improperly used to block competition for asthma as well as COPD treatments. Teva shares are trading little change right now. We've got Teva up by about 0.7%. And Chewy shares now trading lower after an initial move higher after Keith Gill, also known as Roaring Kitty, disclosed a 6.6% passive stake in the online pet food and product retailer. Chewy down 5.1%. Those are our top company stories.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenevec and Katie Greifeld in for Carol Massar on this Monday afternoon. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results, all but ensuring that a trial will not happen before the November election. Harold Krent is a professor of law at Chicago-Kent College of Law, and he talked with Bloomberg Intelligence about the contextual analysis of that decision.
The court split the baby in a sense by saying that there was going to be absolute immunity for some kind of presidential acts, those acts that fall within the core of his executive powers, and for other acts, it's presumptive immunity, which means that the lower court will have to go through the indictment and the trial and sort of separate out all the acts.
The justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines and said a federal appeals court was too categorical in rejecting Trump's immunity arguments, ruling for the first time that former presidents are shielded from prosecution for at least some official acts taken while in office. The majority ordered the lower courts to revisit the case. Longtime Trump ally Steve Bannon was taken into custody today. He surrendered at a federal prison to begin a 4-month sentence on contempt charges for defying a subpoena in the congressional investigation into the U.S. Capitol attack. Bannon is also facing criminal charges in New York State court, alleging he duped donors who gave money to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Tim Stenevec and Katie Greifeld.
Hey, thanks so much, Amy. Do appreciate that. Hey, Katie, did you go to the Eras tour?
No, and I'm kind of sensitive about it.
Oh, you
I
are, really?
actually really wanted to go, but
Is it too late? Is it over, or can you still go in like Europe or something?
You can still go in Europe,
Okay.
but like that's a lot of planning.
It's not too late.
It's probably too late, but in any case, we're talking about Taylor Swift for a specific reason here, Tim.
Yeah, and that's because there's always a business angle when it comes to Taylor Swift. After all, this is the Eras tour that we're talking about, which in the U.S. just last year added $4.3 billion to GDP. That's according to estimates from Bloomberg Economics. The reason we're talking about it today, though, is because that stage that's currently being used on the Eras tour is built by a company called Tate, and that company is exploring a potential sale, Katie, which could value it at more than $1 billion.
Yeah, this, of course, according to people with knowledge of the matter. Like you said, they create tour staging for live events. And in addition to Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, it's also worked on sets for Rihanna's Super Bowl halftime show, Beyonce's Renaissance World Tour also last year, as well as Swift's Reputation Tour back in 2018. So
Did you
Taylor
go to any
Swift,
of those?
The last
Concerts?
time I saw Taylor Swift was in 2011.
You did see her. You did see a show?
Of course.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How was it?
I mean, as a millennial woman, yeah, I've seen Taylor Swift before.
What show?
It was somewhere in New Jersey. I went the summer after high school.
I wonder if it was part of a big tour, if the company, I mean, if she wasn't as big as she is now, obviously, but she was still pretty big then.
It was the Speak Now tour. It was pretty huge.
I wonder
it was a stadium.
I wonder if she was using a stage designed by Tate, the engineering firm.
It's a good question because obviously she is a repeat customer of this firm. And I mean, it's interesting. We'll see a $1.3 billion valuation. We'll see if that sale actually goes through. But yeah, I mean, you think about everything that goes into the whole phenomenon that is a world tour. And these are some of the companies that benefit.
Founded by Michael Tate back in 1978, they've produced sets for brand experiences for Alphabet, NBA, and other companies as well. Hey, that is going to do it for Bloomberg Business Week, at least the TV edition. If you're staying with us on Bloomberg TV, the close is up next. If you're sticking with us on Bloomberg Radio, we're going to tell you about AI with the CMO at SAP and that New Jersey NYC commute. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday, July 1st, 2024. I'm Tim Stenevec. Carol Masser is off on assignment. Today, in her place, we have with us Bloomberg TV's Katie Greifeld. Katie, how are you?
I'm great. I love being back on the radio with you, Tim.
It has been a long time.
It's been a long time. They moved me to the mornings, so that's
so usually by this time, you're done. You're out. Because your bedtime is coming up.
Oh, yeah.
Soon.
No, I take a nap in the afternoons. I'm not exaggerating. Just a quick 30 minutes reset, dive back in. But yeah, this is late for me.
The naps for adults and kids alike.
I mean,
That's
it's
great.
important. You just reset the brain, you take a little break, and then you get back straight down to business. But
okay, can I do a transition? Speaking of a reset.
I was hoping you would.
Okay, cool. We are seeing the S&P 500 higher by 0.1%. We're seeing the bond market, though, really the focus right now. We're going to talk to Abigail Doolittle about both of those things in just a minute. Also, you go between New Jersey and New York City a lot.
Frequently. 3 times a week.
Always driving?
Always driving.
You're not taking New Jersey Transit
I
ever?
was born and raised in the suburbs, so yeah, I drive.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, if you're coming in every day, you're taking New Jersey Transit probably. And it's not just you. That commute is turning longer, costlier, and worse. We're going to talk about it in just a second.
We'll also be talking AI, of course. This time we're going to be speaking about it with the CMO of SAP.
And the fried chicken sandwich wars.
Delicious.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and then
I haven't tried any. I just read the story.
I actually went to Chick-fil-A at lunch, but I don't think they're quite in the war there. But anyway, we're also going to be joined by the co-founder of Waze, who wants you to take a test. We'll explain.
All that and more over the next 2 hours. First up, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie.
All right, I thank you very much. We're moving into the final hour of trading on this Monday, holiday shortened trading week. And right now, we have got the Dow swinging between gains and losses. Back in the green just a couple of minutes ago, turned negative briefly, but right now up 4 points. Little change there on the Dow. S&P up 6, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up 105 right now, higher by 0.6%. 10-year 4.47% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.77%. Gold up $4 the ounce now, $23.30 up 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude now at $83.40 a barrel, up by about 2.3%. So bottom line here, stocks struggling for direction, but still green on the screen. S&P up 0.1. Emily Bowersock-Hill is the CEO and founding partner at Bowersock Capital Partners, and she says parts of the tech market are definitely overextended, but she still likes another part of the mega cap world.
I do think the valuation of companies like NVIDIA has gotten a little bit ridiculous, so I think people should expect short-term corrections, but in some of these stocks. But for the long term, I think that's, quite frankly, we would stick, or we would at least veer towards mega cap companies with a lot of scale and a lot of cash.
Emily Bowersock-Hill of Bowersock Capital Partners, she mentioned NVIDIA up by 0.4%. Boeing has agreed to buy back Spirit Aerosystems Holdings for $37.25 a share. It is an all-stock deal. Shares of both companies are advancing. Right now, we got Boeing up 2.2%, Spirit Aerosystems up by 3.5%. Recapping, S&P up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie. Certainly do appreciate it. Well, you just heard the numbers there from Charlie Pellet about the equity market, all in the green, but not moving much, except for the NASDAQ higher by 0.6%. The world's biggest bond market, though, getting hit as traders weighing the potential economic implications of the U.S. presidential election come November. Somebody who watches it all is Abigail Doolittle. She's Bloomberg News chief markets correspondent. She's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Dealer's choice. Do you want to start with equities or bonds right now?
I'm going to defer that back to you.
So I guess I'm okay.
You'll be the dealer.
I will be the dealer. I want to start with the bond market and what's going on with yields up across the curve. We're not seeing that hit equities too much, and it's not quite enough to say that it's a reset, but certainly up across the curve, especially at the long end.
It is interesting, and especially in light of that ISM manufacturing number, it was a little bit weaker. So if anything, you would think that bond yields would be down on the possibility that that could support the idea that the Fed will be cutting this year. And earlier, when that report came out and yields were higher, we did, of course, have stocks a little bit lower, but we've seen a recovery, but nothing too robust. We have the S&P 500 up 0.1%, the NASDAQ 100 up a bit more, up 0.4%. And then we, of course, have the divergence between growth and value because the Russell 2000 and the Dow Transports, both of those down about 0.8%. But relative to the bond market and the two-year yield, this chart, because we have been talking about it for months, is still setting up for the possibility of a massive move higher. And by massive, I mean above 6%. If that were to happen, you know, it's hard to say what could actually trigger that. The two-year yield.
Wow.
That technically, the chart over
it's
the last year.
It's at 4.76% right now.
Yes, so it would be a massive, massive move higher. But remember, Jamie Dimon has actually said 6% and even 8%.
On the 10-year.
On the 10-year, but the two-year, you would think, unless the curve straightens out anytime soon, would be higher. Or thereabouts.
I get the technical aspect of that, but you just think fundamentally. I mean,
it's hard to get there.
Yeah, like
I
feel like we'd need so many more rate hikes, which are not even in the conversation.
Maybe we'd have to have some really bad, some bad inflationary data. The other thing is, this is interesting. So Fed Chair Jay Powell is going to be speaking a couple times over the next couple of weeks. The meeting at the Washington Economic Club on, I believe, July 15th or thereabouts, I know from a source that he, on an emergency, I should take that back and walk that back, that he, Fed Chair Jay Powell, or his team reached out to the Washington Economic Council or Club and asked to be able to speak there just last week. And they were freaking out because he's never done that before. So the person who shared this with me, who lives in D.C. and is pretty connected, but was comfortable with me sharing it, not with the person's name attached, of course, said that there's a lot of speculation about what does he want to talk about. But it's, of course, right before the quiet period ends. Now, is he going to go there and say, we're going to be hiking 5 times? No, of course not. But it is interesting. I mean, I'm certainly going to be paying attention to that one to see what was so important that he needs to schedule this extra ability to jawbone.
I think if Jay Powell calls and says, "Can I speak at this event?" You say yes.
You say yes.
Okay,
but apparently they were freaking out. That was that they were real, and they were.
I would freak out
and
if
they
he
were,
called me.
Really trying to figure out.
He calls me all the time.
Yeah.
Just kidding. No, he doesn't. So that's the bond market story.
That's the bond market.
And it just feels like, in general, over the past few months, arguably over the past few years, it's the bond market that's been more volatile than the stock market. That is particularly true today, and I feel like it's going to be the case this week because, I don't know, when you have July 4th on a Thursday, how exciting
not a lot's going to happen trading-wise. Let's see what the S&P 500 volume's doing to make your point. Although I don't know if I agree with over the last couple of years that yes, but stocks have been, I think, more volatile than maybe given credit for. So volumes actually, it was very light on the open. Right now, it's just off a little bit. It had been a little bit above. So stocks up just a little bit, as I was mentioning earlier. They were down a little bit, so really not doing all that much. I think that what really has my attention is that NVIDIA earlier today had been down significantly. That was the market drag. Now it's up 0.8%, but the technicals on that chart, it really appears to be putting in some sort of a topping pattern, which is a fancy way of saying that the sellers who bought really well at levels well below from here, instead of selling all at once to create a disruption and a panic in the stock, they sell over time so as to take their profits at a level that's higher. And then when there's a piece of news that the markets don't like, either about NVIDIA, one of its competitors, or from a macro standpoint, they simply sell and they take profits very, very quickly at that point. But it's an interesting pattern. It looks pretty strong, and it looks like it could send NVIDIA below 100, even with today's bounce back.
Tesla
up
6%.
Yes, a good day.
Still down 15% this year.
Yeah, so NIO put up, one of the Chinese EV makers, they put up a good number for the last quarter in terms of deliveries, a little bit more than 21,000. What's so interesting, though, is Tesla, and that's above the estimate, it also points to growth. What's so interesting is Tesla puts out their second quarter numbers tomorrow, and their number is above 440,000. So it just shows you the difference in size between Tesla's deliveries and one of the top China EV names. And, you know, talking stocks, can we talk Chewy and GameStop?
You know, I was hoping that we would, because I'm talking about
That's one of your gainers, decliners. Was already a gainer.
It was a gainer. Now it's a decliner.
Now it's a
I need to
decliner.
talk about it intelligently.
Oh, Katie, you would have that.
No, tell me what's going on so I can just say it again.
So this, I mean, honestly,
that's why we have Abigail on.
This is the story that just keeps on giving. So, of course, last week, Keith Gill, also known as Roaring Kitty, put out a meme of a dog. I've now been told it's a puppy, a picture of a puppy, a cartoon puppy on X. And
Still
on
a
that,
dog, to be
Still
fair.
a dog. You're right. You're right. To be fair, it's still a dog. On that, the shares of Chewy and Petco soared. Chewy went from being solidly negative to up